If you're ready to rest, you're in the right place. Close your eyes, relax your body, and drift into a slower time. You can also let us know in the comments where in the world you currently are and what time it is for you. In the grand tradition of historical con jobs, the donation of Constantine is like the Mona Lisa of medieval forgeries, a masterpiece of deception with enough audacity to make a Ponzi scheme look like a charitable donation. Picture this, we're in the 8th century, a time when the closest thing to fact-checking was a monk squinting at a scroll by candlelight. Into the donation of Constantine, a document claiming that the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, who reigned from 36 to 3037 AD, had transferred authority over Rome and the entirety of the Western Roman Empire to the Pope. That's right, folks. It was basically an 8th century version of saying, "Hey Pope, you win a free empire, just pay the shipping and handling." Now, why would anyone fall for such a thing? Because in an era without Google, people took their documents very seriously. And this one? It was a blockbuster, complete with its own plot twists and world-changing revelations. The document claimed that Constantine was so grateful for being cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I that he decided to hand over the keys to the Roman Empire to the papacy. If you're thinking that sounds fishy, congratulations, you've got better taste than many medieval rulers. But for the papacy, this was like finding a golden ticket to the chocolate factory of power. For centuries, this forgery was the bedrock of papal claims to temporal power. Popes waved it around like a winning lottery ticket saying, "See? We own this joint." It was used to justify the papal states and wield influence over European kings and emperors. The most hilarious part? The document was as historically accurate as a medieval Back to the Future script. Anachronisms included. The language and terms used were so glaringly out of place, they might as well have included a reference to a Pepsi commercial. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. The donation of Constantine was likely cooked up in the 8th century, around the 750s, a time when the popes were looking to assert more independence from the Byzantine Empire and needed a little something to boost their street cred. It was most likely the work of a particularly ambitious member of the Roman Curia, but the exact mastermind remains as mysterious as a Renaissance art heist. Despite its dubious origins, the document was taken at face value for a whopping 700 years. That's not just a long con, that's a marathon of medieval deceit. Even Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, seemed to have taken it seriously, and he was no slouch when it came to statecraft. This document was like the medieval equivalent of finding out your favorite influencer's followers are all bots. Devastating if you're an emperor looking for divine legitimacy. The story takes a delightful turn in the 15th century, when Renaissance scholar Lorenzo Valla decided to play Sherlock Holmes. Valla, a man with a keen eye for linguistic detail and a healthy skepticism of anything too good to be true, examined the donation and called it out for the fraud it was. He pointed out that the Latin used in the document was more contemporary to his own time than to Constantine's, and that certain terms and bureaucratic titles didn't exist in the 4th century. Valla's analysis was like a mic drop in the world of historical critique. Valla's debunking was a triumph of reason over tradition, but it didn't immediately change the game. The Catholic Church didn't officially concede the forgery until the 19th century, which goes to show that institutions, like people, have a hard time admitting when they've been duped. So, why does any of this matter, apart from giving us a chuckle at the expense of medieval gullibility? The donation of Constantine is a prime example of how narratives, even false ones, can shape history. It shows us the power of documents and ideas in constructing political realities. The fact that a piece of parchment could influence the course of European politics for centuries is a testament to the power of belief over fact, a tale as old as time and as relevant as ever. In essence, the donation of Constantine is a cautionary tale wrapped in a historical farce, reminding us to question everything, especially the things that seem too good to be true. After all, if a single forgery can sway the fate of empires, imagine what a well-timed tweet could do today. Speaking of belief over fact, let's fast forward to the 1980s, a decade famous for big hair, bigger shoulder pads, and apparently some of the biggest historical blunders ever made. Enter the Hitler Diaries, a scandal so audacious it could make the donation of Constantine look like a polite clerical error. This was a time when German magazine Stern thought they'd hit the historical jackpot, but instead they were the ones paying out. A whopping 9 million to be precise, on what turned out to be nothing more than a glorified collection of doodles and daydreams. Now you might wonder, how does one end up spending that much on a forgery? Well, it all started with a man named Konrad Kujau, a German forger with a flair for drama that would make a soap opera star blush. Kujau, who had a history of selling fake Nazi memorabilia, saw an opportunity in the public's insatiable appetite for anything Hitler-related. The world was still reeling from the horrors of World War II, and anything that promised a peek into Hitler's mind was sure to sell like hotcakes at a bake sale. Kujau crafted the diaries with all the finesse of a master illusionist, using old notebooks, aged paper, and a concoction of ink that mimicked the period. He even added a personal touch with Hitler's initials embossed on each volume. A signature move that should have screamed fake as loudly as a neon sign in a blackout. But why did these diaries catch fire like a stack of dry kindling? Because, folks, the allure of uncovering secrets from one of history's most infamous figures was too tantalizing to resist. The diaries promised to reveal Hitler's innermost thoughts, his favorite hobbies, even his preferred brand of mustard. Spoiler alert, none of these revelations were true. Yet the potential scoop was juicy enough to make serious historians drool and editors at Stern magazine salivate as if they'd just stumbled upon the holy grail of journalism. And here's where it gets really wild. Stern wasn't the only one fooled. Renowned experts, including Hugh Trevor Roper, a historian of considerable repute, vouched for their authenticity. Trevor Roper, who had written extensively on the Third Reich, initially declared the diaries genuine after a cursory examination, a decision he would later regret more than a New Year's Eve tattoo. It turns out, even the best of us can have an off day when it comes to sniffing out forgeries, especially when the promise of historical revelation is dangling in front of us like a carrot on a stick. The economic context of the 1980s also played a significant role in this debacle. It was a period of booming media expansion, with networks and publications vying for sensational stories that could drive up sales and viewership. The Hitler Diaries was seen as a blockbuster exclusive, an irresistible story that was sure to generate headlines and, more importantly, revenue. Stern magazine was banking on the diaries not just to sell copies, but to secure their place in journalistic history. Instead, they ended up with a front-row seat in history's Hall of Shame, a cautionary tale about the perils of prioritizing profit over prudence. So, how did the truth finally come out, you ask? Well, it wasn't through any grand confession on Kujau's part. The unravelling of this grand deception came from a combination of forensic science and good old-fashioned journalistic skepticism. The West German Federal Archives and experts in handwriting analysis tore through the diaries like a team of detectives on a mission. They discovered inconsistencies in the ink and paper that were impossible to reconcile with the 1940s. The diaries were exposed as forgeries, and Kujau, along with Stern's editor at the time, ended up facing the music in court. It was a trial that captivated the public, a juicy courtroom drama where the gavel of justice came down as hard as the reality of their gullibility. The Hitler Diaries scandal is a prime example of how the hunger for historical insight can sometimes blind us to glaring inconsistencies. It highlights the human tendency to believe what we desperately wish to be true, even when all signs point to the contrary. This scandal also underscores the economic pressures on media outlets to deliver sensational stories, sometimes at the cost of due diligence and critical skepticism. In a world where information is currency, the Hitler Diaries remind us that not everything that glitters is gold. Sometimes it's just fool's gold wrapped in a pretty package waiting to be unwrapped by those too eager to see what they want to see. This affair left a lasting mark on the field of historical research and journalistic integrity, a sobering reminder that even the most seasoned experts can be led astray by the siren call of a too-good-to-be-true narrative. But we're not done yet. This tale is just one chapter in the long and storied history of forgeries and fabrications. So stay tuned, because there's always more where this came from. The world of historical deception is vast and varied, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface. And so, with the ink barely dry on our last tale of historical mischief, we tumble headfirst into the wild, woolly world of the secret history of the Mongols. This 13th century saga promises to be as thrilling and convoluted as any medieval telenovela, complete with its own brand of intrigue, brutality, and, of course, the larger-than-life figure of Genghis Khan at its centre. First off, let's set the scene. The Secret History of the Mongols is like the ultimate fan fiction penned by someone who was just a tad too close to the main characters. Written around 1240, just 3 years after Genghis Khan's death, it serves as both a chronicle and a cautionary tale, blending the gritty reality of Mongol life with the mythic grandeur of its founder. And if you're expecting an unbiased, objective account, well, you might as well be looking for a vegetarian at a Mongolian barbecue. Let's just say this text has more spin than a politician's press release. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, was a man of humble beginnings who united the fractious Mongol tribes into a fearsome empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Now, according to the Secret History, this transformation wasn't just about military genius or savvy alliances. Oh no, it involved divine intervention, prophetic dreams, and enough drama to make the Kardashians seem low-key. This document is part biography, part origin story, and part epic poem, a Mongolian Iliad, with a touch of soap opera thrown in for good measure. Economically speaking, the Mongol Empire was a juggernaut. At its peak, it controlled the Silk Road, the ancient highway of trade that connected the riches of the East with the markets of the West. We're talking about a network that facilitated the exchange of everything from silks and spices to ideas and innovations. The Mongols, ever the savvy administrators, imposed taxes on goods passing through their territory, filling their coffers while maintaining a semblance of order across their vast empire. So, when we talk about Genghis Khan and his successors, we're not just discussing marauding hordes on horseback, but the architects of one of history's most formidable economic engines. But back to the Secret History. Why does it read like a medieval action movie script with plot holes you could drive a yak cart through? For starters, it was written by someone with a vested interest in glorifying the Mongol legacy, likely a member of the elite who'd witnessed these events firsthand or heard them recounted over countless campfires. The text is replete with legendary tales, like that of young Temujin escaping captivity by hiding in a river, breathing through a reed. It's a tale worthy of a Hollywood thriller, even if the logistics of surviving in a freezing river remain, shall we say, questionable. And then there are the sudden character deaths, the kind that would make even George R.R. Martin blush. Allies and enemies alike are dispatched with ruthless efficiency, often with little warning or explanation. It's as if the chronicler, in a bid to keep the narrative brisk and the body count high, decided that a little narrative whiplash was a small price to pay for entertainment value. Now let's talk myth-busting. The Secret History is a document that has shaped much of our understanding or misunderstanding of the Mongol Empire. For starters, the image of Genghis Khan as a bloodthirsty despot isn't entirely accurate. Sure, he was no stranger to warfare, but he was also a shrewd leader who valued loyalty and merit over noble birth. His legal code, the Yasa, emphasized discipline and unity, laying the groundwork for an empire that, despite its fearsome reputation, was remarkably tolerant of different cultures and religions. In fact, under Mongol rule, merchants and scholars from diverse backgrounds found a common ground, a rare occurrence in a period marked by so much division. The Secret History also gives us a glimpse into the personal side of Genghis Khan, portraying him as a man of contradictions, ruthless yet forgiving, a visionary leader with a penchant for pragmatic decisions. He was a man who, legend has it, once declared, "The greatest joy is to conquer one's enemies, yet also showed mercy to those who submitted willingly." It's this complexity that keeps historians entangled in debates, like cats in a ball of yarn, as they try to separate fact from fiction. But why does this matter? Because the way we view historical figures like Genghis Khan influences how we understand the past, and by extension, the present. The romanticized tales of his exploits might make for compelling storytelling, but they also obscure the realities of his regime's impact on the world. Under the Mongols, trade flourished, technological innovations spread, and cross-cultural exchanges became the norm. Yet, this same period was also marked by brutal campaigns, the devastation of entire cities, and the displacement of countless peoples. In many ways, the Secret History of the Mongols is a mirror reflecting our own fascination with power and legacy, It's a reminder that history is often written by the victors, or in this case, the survivors, and that the stories we cling to can be as much about who we want to be as about who we truly are. While the text offers a window into the Mongol psyche, it also challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question the narratives that have been handed down through generations. So, as we wrap up this chapter of historical exploration, remember that the secret history is more than just an ancient text. It's a testament to the enduring power of storytelling. It shows us that history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry woven from the threads of human ambition, folly, and imagination. And as we delve deeper into the annals of time, we'll continue to uncover the stories that shaped our world, one legend at a time. But we're not quite done yet. There's more history to unravel, more myths to debunk, and more tales to tell. Stay tuned, because the past has a funny way of surprising us when we least expect it. All right, folks, buckle up for a journey that's about to take a sharp turn into the realm of the utterly bizarre. We're diving into The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, a 14th century travelogue that reads like a medieval fever dream, complete with dog-headed people and rivers of gold. Honestly, it makes Game of Thrones look like a documentary on birdwatching. But here's the kicker. For centuries, people bought this stuff, hook, line, and sinker. So, why did medieval readers lap up Mandeville's tales like a cat with a saucer of cream? First, let's set the scene. It's the 14th century. Europe is a place where the closest thing to a vacation slideshow is a wandering minstrel's ballad. Along comes The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, a book that promises an all-access pass to the wonders of the East. Written in French around 1357, it was soon translated into numerous languages, spreading faster than a medieval gossip. The book claims to be the first-hand account of Sir John Mandeville, an English knight who supposedly set off around 1322 on a globe-trotting adventure. Just one tiny issue: there's no evidence Sir John ever existed. It's like finding out your favourite celebrity chef is just a mascot for a fast food chain. Now, why would people believe in a book that talks about men with faces on their chests and islands where diamonds grow on trees? Simple curiosity and a dearth of reliable sources. Mandeville's work arrived in a Europe hungry for knowledge about the world beyond its borders. This was an era when maps were more "here be dragons" than GPS precision. In such a context, Mandeville's tales offered a sense of connection to the vast, mysterious world, even if that connection was about as reliable as a medieval bridge in a storm. The thing is, Mandeville's travelogue wasn't merely a collection of whimsical stories. It was a mishmash of earlier travel writings, religious texts, and outright fantasy. It incorporated elements from the works of Marco Polo and the even older tales of the Alexander Romance. Mandeville took these sources, added a dash of his own creative flair, and voila, a medieval bestseller. Think of it as the 14th century equivalent of remix culture, but with fewer beats and more beasts. Economically, Mandeville hit the jackpot. His book became a medieval blockbuster, lapped up by everyone from scholars to merchants looking to understand the markets and cultures of far-off lands. It was a time when trade routes like the Silk Road were bringing exotic goods to European shores, and anything that could offer insights into these lucrative connections was worth its weight in saffron. The book's popularity underscores a fundamental truth. Knowledge, or the illusion of it, has always been a powerful currency. But let's dive into some of the more fantastical claims, shall we? Mandeville describes a land where the people have no heads, yet their faces are situated on their chests. This kind of imagery wasn't entirely new. It echoed the monstrous races from ancient texts. Yet, Mandeville's flair for the dramatic breathed new life into these legends. The appeal here is clear. Even today, we love a good story that stretches the boundaries of reality. It's why we binge-watch sci-fi and fantasy, even when the plot holes are large enough to swallow a spaceship. Now, let's talk about those rivers of gold. Mandeville spins tales of lands overflowing with wealth, where precious metals and gemstones are as common as sand on a beach. It's the kind of story that would make any medieval merchant's heart race faster than a jousting horse. But what's the catch? These stories fed into the myth of the East as a land of untold riches and exotic wonders, fueling the fires of exploration and, eventually, exploitation. It's a classic case of the grass is greener, except in this case it's not grass but gold, and it's growing alongside fields of wild imagination. But why does any of this matter beyond providing a good chuckle at medieval gullibility? because Mandeville's tales reflect a deeper human tendency to blur the lines between fact and fiction when it suits our fancy. His work shows us how stories can shape perceptions and drive actions, even when they're more fiction than fact. For medieval Europeans, Mandeville's travels were a window into a world they could only dream of visiting. They offered a narrative that was as comforting as it was compelling, a way to make sense of a world that was, quite literally, beyond their understanding. And here's where the myth-busting comes in. While it's tempting to dismiss Mandeville's work as pure fantasy, it did serve a purpose. It inspired curiosity, ignited imaginations, and, perhaps most importantly, demonstrated the power of storytelling in shaping worldviews. It's the same reason we still tell tales of Atlantis or Bigfoot. There's something about the unknown that keeps us coming back for more, even when reason tells us to be skeptical. So, as we wrap up this exploration of Mandeville's travels, let's remember that history is often a tapestry woven from both truth and tales. Mandeville's work may have been more fiction than fact, but it also serves as a reminder of the enduring power of stories to captivate, educate, and, occasionally, mislead. And with that, my friends, we leave Sir John Mandeville to his fantastical journeys, as we prepare to embark on the next leg of our own historical adventure. Stay tuned. There's more to uncover, more myths to debunk, and more tales to tell. Before we set sail into the turbulent waters of the Zeno manuscripts, let's anchor ourselves in the 16th century, a time when the word explorer was synonymous with adventurer and risk-taker, or, depending on your perspective, lunatic with a death wish. This was an age when maps were as much a work of imagination as they were of cartography, and the North Atlantic was the ultimate canvas for both ambition and folly. Enter the Zeno brothers, Nicolai and Antonio, whose navigational hoax was like the reality TV of its day. Plenty of drama, little reality, and an audience eager to believe. The Zeno manuscripts, purportedly penned in the 3080s but actually hitting the scene in 1558, claimed to chart territories in the North Atlantic that no European had supposedly set eyes on. The story goes that the Zeno brothers embarked on a grand voyage from Venice, winding up in the frozen north, possibly the Faroe Islands, Iceland, or even Greenland. Their maps depicted mythical lands like Friesland, a place as real as a unicorn on roller skates. But why did anyone care about these dubious scribbles? Because, in the 16th century, maps were the original clickbait, promising untold riches and fame to anyone with the nerve to follow them. Here's the kicker. These maps presented themselves as the key to lands rich in resources, the kind that could make a monarch drool more than a buffet at a royal banquet. The promise of discovering new territories that might rival the wealth of the Americas was a tantalizing prospect. At a time when Europe was racing to carve up the world like holiday turkey, the Zeno manuscripts seemed to offer an edge in the high-stakes game of imperial expansion. Economically, the stakes were astronomical. The costs associated with funding voyages of exploration were steep. Think millions in today's dollars. Monarchs and merchants alike were eager for returns that could justify such expenditures. This was a period when the lure of gold and new trade routes could make or break a kingdom's fortune. The Zeno manuscripts, with their fictional geography, promised shortcuts to wealth that, in reality, were as illusory as the lands they described. Yet, the story of the Zeno brothers was not just a tale of deception, it was a reflection of the human penchant for believing in the extraordinary. It's the same impulse that keeps us glued to tales of lost cities and hidden treasures. The Zeno manuscripts fed into the collective imagination, offering a narrative of discovery and conquest that was irresistible to an audience primed by tales of Columbus and Magellan. In a way, they were the cinematic blockbuster of their time, complete with exotic settings and larger-than-life characters, only lacking a CGI budget and a catchy soundtrack. But let's not sail too far off course. The Zeno manuscripts were exposed as a hoax in the centuries following their publication. As cartographic knowledge advanced, the glaring inaccuracies in the maps became as obvious as a bad toupee. Historians and geographers began to peel back the layers of fiction, revealing a story cobbled together from half-truths and outright fabrications. The supposed voyage of the Zeno brothers was more a flight of fancy than a documented expedition, with the maps serving as little more than elaborate doodles on history's margins. So, why does any of this matter? Because the Zeno manuscripts illustrate a fundamental truth about human nature, our willingness to believe in narratives that promise more than reality can deliver. They remind us that the allure of the unknown often blinds us to the evidence before our eyes. The manuscripts were a symptom of their time, reflecting both the ambitions and the limitations of an age poised on the brink of the modern world. They show us that history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry woven from the dreams and deceptions of those who lived it. As we cast a critical eye over these ancient maps, we see not just the folly of their creators, but also the enduring power of myth in shaping human endeavours. The Zeno manuscripts are a testament to the fact that, sometimes, the stories we tell ourselves are more compelling than the facts we can prove. They remind us that exploration is as much about the journey within as it is about the lands we seek to uncover. So, as we close the chapter on the Zeno manuscripts, let's take a moment to reflect on the enduring legacy of such tales. They are a reminder that history is filled with stories both real and imagined, and that the line between the two is often as blurred as the maps of old. As we navigate the seas of our own modern myths, it's worth remembering that every map, every narrative, every story carries within it the hopes and dreams of those who dared to dream them. And that, perhaps, is the greatest adventure of all. In the medieval world, castles were the medieval equivalent of the hottest real estate on the market. Everyone wanted one, and if you had one, everyone else wanted to take it from you. But these weren't just fancy stone mansions. They were the ultimate status symbol, a fortress of power, and a really inconvenient place to have to siege if you were the guy stuck outside. Think of them as the original gated communities, minus the pool and tennis courts, but plus a moat and battlements. Now, let's get one thing straight. Sieges were not the romantic, gallant affairs Hollywood sometimes makes them out to be. They were more like a medieval version of waiting in a really long line at the DMV, but with a lot more mud and a higher risk of getting hit with a trebuchet. You see, a siege wasn't about immediate gratification. It was about who could hold their breath the longest, while everyone slowly went broke and hungry. The logistics of a siege were mind-boggling. You needed an army, and not just any army, a medieval army capable of camping out for weeks or even months on end. Let's talk numbers. A typical medieval army might have numbered in the thousands, and each soldier needed food, water, and supplies. Feeding thousands of men? It was like running a medieval food truck festival, but with the looming threat of dysentery. The cost of maintaining such an army was staggering. The English army's campaign in France during the 100 Years' War, for instance, could cost around £5,000 per month, a sum that could bankrupt a small kingdom faster than you can say, tax hike. This kind of cash flow problem explains why the medieval kings were always so keen on marrying off their daughters to the highest bidder. Every little bit helped. And while we're on the topic of knights, those shiny suits of armor were not all they were cracked up to be. They were heavy, hot, and downright uncomfortable. If you've ever worn a three-piece suit to a summer wedding, you've got a small taste of what it must have been like to sit in metal plates under the sun all day. Knights looked impressive, sure, but they were also the medieval equivalent of a clunky, high-maintenance sports car. Great for showing off, less great for practicality. To lay siege to a castle was to engage in a highly strategic waiting game. The besieging army camped outside, building trenches and siege engines like catapults, trebuchets, and the occasional battering ram, all while hoping the folks inside would run out of food before they did. Digging trenches was an art form. It was all about getting close enough to the castle without getting skewered by arrows, a medieval take on hot and cold, but with a lot more at stake than just finding a hidden object. For the folks inside the castle, it was all about rationing supplies and praying for reinforcements or a miracle. You can bet that when a castle was finally relieved, it was time for the medieval equivalent of a victory parade, complete with whatever passed for confetti in those days, probably more mud. The romantic image of knights gallantly charging to the rescue is a nice story, but the gritty reality was a lot less glamorous. Knights and soldiers spent most of their time waiting, digging, and grumbling about the lack of decent ale. And speaking of which, ale was a crucial part of any medieval siege, acting as both a morale booster and a safer alternative to water, which was often suspect. So, why did everyone want these stone fortresses so badly? Besides the obvious appeal of not having to worry about getting invaded every Tuesday, castles were a symbol of power and control. They were the medieval equivalent of a top-notch security system, a declaration of "I'm in charge here, complete with a battalion of archers to make sure everyone got the message. In short, the appeal of the castle was a mix of practicality and power, safety and status, a combination that could drive any medieval lord to spend a fortune on stone walls and drawbridges. Yet, the reality of taking or defending one was far from the gallant tales sung by bards. It was a grueling test of endurance, resources, and sometimes sheer luck. And while the myths make it sound like a thrilling adventure, in reality, it was more like a very high-stakes waiting game, where the prize was survival and the cost was measured not just in gold, but in lives. Sieges were like the medieval version of a high-stakes chess game, with both sides trying to outsmart and outlast the other. Except instead of knights and bishops, you had trebuchets and battering rams. Arguably less regal, but way more fun to talk about. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of these siege weapons, starting with the trebuchet, the rock star of medieval artillery. The trebuchet was the big kahuna of siege engines, a gravity-powered marvel that could hurl rocks heavier than your Aunt Edna's fruitcake over enormous distances up to 300 meters, give or take. These behemoths were the Ferraris of the siege world, except instead of speed, they delivered destruction with impeccable style. Imagine a wooden arm, as long as a telephone pole, swinging down with the force of 1,000 angry villagers. That's the trebuchet for you. But how did these giants work their magic? Simple physics, my friends. The trebuchet relied on a counterweight, sometimes a hefty 10,000 kilograms, to provide the muscle needed to launch projectiles through the air. It was the medieval equivalent of a slam dunk, except instead of a basketball, you had a boulder, and instead of a hoop, you had a castle wall. Talk about a game changer. However, building a trebuchet was no small feat. It required not only skilled carpenters, but also a hefty budget. Constructing one could cost as much as £800, a small fortune at a time when the average peasant earned pennies a day. But oh, the results were worth it. When everything went according to plan, the sight of a trebuchet in action was enough to send defenders running for cover, or at least to the nearest chapel for a quick prayer. Of course, medieval life wouldn't be medieval life without a fair share of oopsie-daisy moments, and trebuchets were no exception. You see, getting the balance just right was crucial. Too much counterweight, and the arm might snap, too little, and your rock wouldn't even make it past the moat. There were stories of trebuchets misfiring spectacularly, launching projectiles in the wrong direction and causing more damage to the besiegers than the besieged. Talk about friendly fire. Now, while the trebuchet might have hogged the spotlight, it wasn't the only player on the field. Enter the battering ram, less flashy certainly, but no less effective. If the trebuchet was the rock star, the battering ram was the workhorse, plodding away with relentless determination. Ramming a castle gate required a sturdy log, often reinforced with metal, and a team of soldiers with the stamina of marathon runners. It was the medieval equivalent of a door-to-door salesman, persistent, annoying, and eventually successful. Battering rams were a bargain compared to the trebuchet. Building one might set you back around £100, a steal for the budget-conscious besieger. Yet, using a battering ram was a bit like a medieval trust fall. You had to get up close and personal with the castle, all while being pelted with arrows, rocks, and anything else the defenders could get their hands on. It was a tough gig, and not for the faint of heart. But the true unsung heroes of siege warfare were the engineers who designed these machines. These were the mad scientists of the medieval world, tinkering with gears and levers, calculating trajectories, and dreaming up new ways to breach those stone fortresses. They might not have gotten the glory of the knights, but without their ingenuity, many a siege would have ended in a stalemate, or worse, a retreat. And let's not forget the economic realities that drove these sieges. The decision to lay siege to a castle was not taken lightly. It was an investment, a gamble that could either pay off handsomely or leave you bankrupt and humiliated. Kings and lords had to weigh the costs and benefits, considering everything from the price of grain to the political implications of victory or defeat. In the grand tapestry of history, siege warfare was as much about economics and engineering as it was about brute strength and valor. And while the myths paint a picture of gallant knights and noble battles, the reality was often a slog of mud, sweat, and ingenuity. It was a testament to human creativity and tenacity, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the sword, but the mind that wields it. As we continue to explore the fascinating world of medieval sieges, Remember that every trebuchet misfire and battering ram splinter tells a story not just of conquest and ambition, but of the people who dared to dream big and aim higher. And who knows, maybe next time you find yourself facing a seemingly insurmountable obstacle, you'll channel your inner medieval engineer and find a way to catapult over it. Stay tuned, because there's plenty more where that came from. As we catapult our way over the obstacles of medieval siege warfare, let's not forget that the battlefield was as much in the mind as it was in the mud. Welcome to the world of psychological warfare, where the real battles were often fought with whispers, shadows, and the occasional well-timed bribe. If you thought espionage was just for modern-day spy thrillers, think again. Spies were the medieval equivalent of Wi-Fi hackers, slipping past defenses to gather crucial intel. They were the unsung heroes, or villains, depending on your perspective, armed with nothing more than sharp wits and a knack for blending in. Rumors, my friends, were the medieval version of breaking news, and they spread faster than a viral tweet. A single whisper in the right ear could sow panic among the defenders, leading them to believe reinforcements were just around the corner or that their beloved leader had fled. Imagine the chaos when rumors of a plague within the castle walls began to circulate. In an era where superstition was as common as the plague itself, such a rumor could be more devastating than any trebuchet. But let's not forget the art of intimidation, a psychological tactic that's as old as warfare itself. Picture this. A besieging army might line up their soldiers, display their weapons, and make a lot of noise. The message was clear. We're here, we're many, and we're not going anywhere. It was the medieval equivalent of a flex on Instagram, except with a lot more at stake than just social media clout. And if that wasn't enough, a well-placed bribe could turn the tide of a siege faster than you can say betrayal. Forget months of hard labor. Sometimes all it took was a few coins slipped into the right hands to open a gate or silence a troublesome guard. Religion, too, had a starring role in this mental chess game. For the attackers, claiming that God was on their side was like having the ultimate celebrity endorsement. Meanwhile, defenders would pray for divine intervention, hoping for a miracle that would save them from the grim fate of conquest. Propaganda, wrapped in religious fervor, was the medieval equivalent of a political campaign, rallying troops and citizens alike with tales of righteous battles and glorious victories. And speaking of propaganda, let's talk about those grandiose speeches and proclamations. Imagine a medieval lord standing atop a hill, shouting to his troops about the nobility of their cause, the righteousness of their mission, and the eternal glory that awaited them. It was like a medieval TED Talk, designed to bolster morale and remind everyone why they were enduring this muddy, lice-infested nightmare in the first place. Yet, for every inspiring speech, there was a sobering reality. The odds of survival were slim, and the rewards were often less tangible than the promise of eternal glory. Now, if you think psychological warfare was a one-sided affair, think again. Defenders had their own tricks up their sleeves, like staging false surrenders to lure attackers into a trap, or using their own spies to feed misinformation back to the enemy. It was a game of cat and mouse, with each side trying to outwit the other in a battle of nerves and cunning. The psychological toll was immense, with soldiers and civilians alike living in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing if today would be the day the walls fell or help arrived. In the midst of all this mental maneuvering, the role of the castle as a symbol of power cannot be overstated. To take a castle was to take its reputation, its prestige, and its strategic advantage. It was a blow not just to the defenders' physical defences, but to their very identity. No wonder rulers were willing to spend fortunes and risk lives to hold on to these stone fortresses. The stakes were high, and the rewards, both tangible and intangible, were worth the gamble. So, as we delve deeper into the world of medieval sieges, remember that the real battles were often fought in the mind, where fear and doubt could be as deadly as any sword. Stay tuned, because our exploration of this fascinating chapter in history is far from over. There are more secrets to uncover, more truths to reveal, and more myths to bust as we continue our journey through the gritty, glorious world of medieval warfare. And as we shift our gaze from the muddy fields of siege warfare to the stone walls where defenders clung to hope, we find ourselves in a world defined less by gallant charges and more by grim endurance. Inside those echoing halls, life during a siege was a study in survival, where the real heroes weren't always the ones brandishing swords, but those who could stretch a sack of grain longer than a medieval epic. Stockpiling supplies was the first line of defense. Think of it as medieval meal prep, but with a slightly more intense focus on not starving to death. A well-fortified castle would ideally be stocked with enough food and water to last several months, sometimes up to a year. This meant thinking ahead and filling storerooms with salted meats, dried beans, and barrels of ale, because if you're going to be stuck inside for months, you might as well have something to take the edge off. Of course, all the planning in the world couldn't guarantee comfort. Fresh produce was a rare luxury, and diets quickly became repetitive. Bread was the staple, and not the artisanal kind you find at a farmer's market. We're talking hard, gritty loaves that would make modern-day sourdough seem like cake. And if you've ever had a roommate who ate all the snacks within the first week, you can imagine the tension when supplies started to dwindle. The walls themselves were both a physical and psychological barrier. To the defenders, they were a comforting presence, a reminder of the strength and security they offered. Yet, those same walls could become a prison as weeks turned into months and the reality of isolation set in. Reinforcing them was a constant task, with soldiers and civilians alike pitching in to repair damage from catapult strikes or undermining attempts. Imagine a community DIY project, but under the constant threat of arrows raining down. Speaking of defense, let's not forget the occasional surprise counterattack. Picture this. A quiet night, the besieging army settling down for a long vigil, and suddenly the castle gate swings open, and out rushes a band of defenders, armed with whatever they could muster. It was a high-stakes game of tag, you're it, with the goal being to disrupt enemy lines and make off with supplies. The element of surprise was crucial, and when successful, these raids could turn the tide of morale and resources. But let's not romanticize this too much. The reality of life under siege was often far more somber. Disease was a relentless foe, creeping through the crowded quarters like a silent predator. Poor sanitation and limited medical knowledge made castles breeding grounds for illness. Dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox were common, turning what should have been a bastion of safety into a hotbed of infection. A well-placed latrine could be as valuable as any fortification, a testament to the less glamorous side of medieval life. And then there's the myth of the valiant last stand, the notion that defenders would rather perish gloriously than surrender. While it makes for a rousing story, reality was often more pragmatic. Many sieges ended not with a heroic battle, but with a quiet negotiation, the defenders choosing to open the gates in exchange for safe passage or a promise of mercy. It was a matter of survival, a cold calculation in a game where lives were the currency. Yet, even the most desperate situations could lead to moments of ingenuity. Tales of defenders using straw dummies to make their numbers seem greater, or lighting fires to create the illusion of reinforcements arriving, were not uncommon. Psychological tricks were as much a part of defense as physical barriers, a reminder that sometimes the mind was the greatest weapon of all. Economically, the cost of a siege was staggering. A castle under siege meant fields left untended, trade routes disrupted, and a community on the brink of collapse. The longer a siege dragged on, the more acute the financial strain became. Rulers had to weigh the cost of holding out against the potential benefits of victory, a balancing act that could mean the difference between maintaining power or losing it all in one fell swoop. Yet, amidst the hardships, there was a peculiar sense of camaraderie. The shared experience of enduring a siege fostered bonds among defenders, a collective resilience born of necessity. It was a reminder of the human spirit's capacity to persevere, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. So, as we peek behind the battlements, we find a story not just of siege engines and battle cries, but of the quieter strength that comes from unity and endurance. The defender's perspective offers a sobering counterpoint to the myths of chivalry and conquest, a reminder that survival is often the greatest victory of all. As we continue this journey through the high-stakes chess game that was medieval siege warfare, there's still more to discover, more myths to unravel, and more stories to tell. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in this tale of stone and steel is just around the corner. As the dust settled and the last echoes of clashing swords faded into the medieval ether, the aftermath of a siege unfolded with all the subtlety of a bear at a beehive. Victorious or vanquished, The effects rippled through the land like a stone tossed into a pond. For the winners, the spoils of war were tantalizing, but often came with strings attached, while the losers faced the grim task of rebuilding shattered lives amid the rubble. Let's start with the winners, shall we? You'd think that after all the blood, sweat and trebuchet launching, the victors would be popping mead corks and living large. And while there were certainly celebrations, the reality was a tad more complicated. Securing a castle meant more than just hanging up new tapestries. It was about maintaining control and proving that you could hold on to your hard-won prize. Imagine the medieval equivalent of winning a fixer-upper on a reality show, only to discover the basement's flooded and the roof leaks like a sieve. Economically, a successful siege was like hitting the jackpot, albeit with a few caveats. The spoils could include anything from precious metals to livestock, not to mention the strategic advantage of a new stronghold. However, the cost of repairing damage, replenishing supplies, and paying off mercenaries could quickly eat into those newfound riches. The Duke of Burgundy, for instance, might have enriched his coffers after a successful campaign, but he'd also find himself knee-deep in IOUs and unpaid soldiers demanding their due. Money talks, but in medieval times it often shouted from an empty purse. Then there's the political chessboard. Capturing a castle could shift the balance of power in a region faster than you can say feudal lord. New alliances were forged, old ones shattered, and the social hierarchy was ever so delicately rearranged. This was high-stakes Game of Thrones, with real lives hanging in the balance. The winners had to cement their newfound dominance, often by marrying off daughters or signing treaties that were as fragile as a dragon's egg. Now, let's not forget the vanquished, who faced a rather less glamorous reality. Surrendering a castle wasn't just about handing over the keys and moving to the medieval equivalent of a studio apartment. It was a gut-wrenching loss of status and security. Imagine the embarrassment of having to tell your neighbours that, yes, the castle was now under new management, and no, you couldn't borrow a cup of sugar because you were all out of castles to barter with. Economically, the aftermath of a siege was a financial disaster for the defeated. Fields lay fallow, trade routes disrupted, and the local economy took a nosedive that would make any modern stockbroker cringe. Rebuilding could take years, and for many, the scars of defeat were etched into the very fabric of their community. It wasn't just about rebuilding walls, but also about mending the social fabric torn asunder by war. Socially, the repercussions were profound. The hierarchy shifted, sometimes drastically, as the defeated lords found themselves demoted in the grand feudal pecking order. This could mean anything, from losing lands to being forced into vassalage under their former enemies. It was a bit like being demoted at work, except instead of getting a pay cut, you lost your home and your dignity. Yet, amidst the ashes of defeat, there were seeds of resilience. Communities banded together, drawing strength from shared hardship. This collective spirit was a testament to the indomitable human will to survive and rebuild, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. It was a quiet defiance, a reminder that while castles might fall, the spirit of the people could not be so easily crushed. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the grand tapestry of history woven by these sieges. Technologically, the constant push to outsmart and outmaneuver opponents led to a veritable arms race of innovation. Siege engines evolved, defences improved, and military tactics became more sophisticated. It was the medieval version of keeping up with the Joneses. Except instead of a new car, you were showing off your latest and greatest catapult design. The long-term consequences were significant. Castles became more formidable, incorporating lessons learned from past sieges into their architecture. Concentric walls, murder holes, and improved battlements were just a few of the innovations that turned castles into formidable fortresses. This was the golden age of castle building, where every stone laid was a testament to the ingenuity and determination of its builders. Yet the impact wasn't confined to the battlefield. The constant state of warfare and the need for protection spurred economic growth in unexpected ways. Towns that sprang up around castles became bustling centres of trade and commerce as people sought the security of stone walls and the opportunities they offered. It was a time of both destruction and creation, a paradox that defined the medieval era. So, why do these brutal, drawn-out struggles continue to captivate our imaginations today? Perhaps it's the sheer drama of it all, the high stakes, the gallant heroes, the cunning strategies. Or maybe it's the timeless appeal of a good underdog story, where the seemingly weaker party triumphs against the odds. Whatever the reason, sieges offer a glimpse into a world where human ingenuity, resilience, and ambition clash in the ultimate test of wills. And as we draw the curtain on this tale of stone and steel, we're left with the realization that history is not just about dates and battles, but about the people who lived through them. It's about the dreams, desires, and decisions that shaped the world we know today. So next time you find yourself gazing at a medieval castle, remember the stories it could tell, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the timeless lessons that echo through the ages. In the end, sieges were more than just battles for land. They were battles for honor, for survival, and for a place in history. And as long as there are stories to tell and lessons to learn, the echoes of these ancient struggles will continue to captivate us, reminding us of the enduring human spirit that refuses to be conquered. In the year 742, a baby named Charles entered a world rife with chaos, ambition, and enough political backstabbing to fill a medieval soap opera. Born in a place that would eventually be called Belgium, Charles, or Charlemagne, as history would remember him, wasn't exactly destined for glory from day one. His dad, Pepin the Short, was a king, albeit one who needed a bit of papal endorsement to make it official. After all, Pepin's ascent was a classic coup d'etat, complete with a dethroned king and the blessing of Pope Zachary, who probably had a side gig as a medieval kingmaker. Fast forward a couple of decades, and young Charles was carving out his own path through the wild landscape of 8th century Europe. At the tender age of 26, in 768, he became king of the Franks, sharing the throne with his brother Charlemagne in a setup that was as awkward as a family road trip in a cramped car. The Frankish kingdom was a sprawling beast, stretching from modern-day France to parts of Germany, and managing it required more than just a sharp sword. It demanded a mind as sharp as a Viking's axe. Now, the political climate of the time was about as stable as a three-legged stool. The Merovingian dynasty, which ruled before Pepin, was on the brink of irrelevance, more figurehead than actual power. In this world of shifting allegiances and fragile alliances, Charles had to be clever, charming, and, when needed, a little ruthless. Think of him as a medieval Machiavelli, minus the Italian flair. One of Charles's first moves as king was to establish his dominance over Aquitaine, a region known for its rebellious spirit. Charles was no stranger to military campaigns, and he didn't shy away from flexing his muscles. In fact, he was so good at warfare that his campaigns often looked like a particularly aggressive game of Risk. His secret weapon? Not just brute force, but the ability to inspire loyalty among his followers. His warriors didn't just fight for him, they believed in him. Quite the PR genius, if you ask me. But Charles wasn't just a man of action. He had a knack for diplomacy, too. His marriage portfolio was more diverse than a modern-day investment strategy. His first wife, Desiderata, was a Lombard princess, a union that was as strategic as it was short-lived. Charles divorced her faster than you can say imperial ambitions, but not before solidifying ties with the Lombards, a move that would pay off when he decided he wanted their crown for himself. While he's often depicted as the noble king who loved education and culture, it's worth remembering that Charles's reign was as much about savvy political maneuvers as it was about fostering the Carolingian Renaissance. He understood the power of optics, and that sometimes a well-timed marriage could do more for his kingdom than a dozen battles. Navigating the treacherous waters of Frankish politics wasn't just about who you knew, it was also about who you could outsmart. Charles's ascent to power was marked by his ability to maintain a delicate balance between his own ambitions and the expectations of the nobility and the church. He had a talent for keeping everyone just happy enough, like a medieval juggler with a penchant for power plays. But let's not get too carried away with the legend. Beneath the shiny veneer of the father of Europe was a man who knew when to wield the sword and when to sheathe it. His rule was marked by a series of wars that expanded his empire and solidified his reputation as a formidable leader. Whether it was battling the Saxons or dealing with insubordination within his own ranks, Charles approached each challenge with a mix of brute force and clever strategy. It wasn't just his military exploits that made Charles a notable figure. It was also his vision for a united Europe, one that was culturally and religiously cohesive. He understood that power wasn't just about territory, it was about influence. And so, he positioned himself as a protector of the papacy, a move that was as much about securing divine favour as it was about practical politics. Charles's alliance with the Pope was mutually beneficial. The Pope got a protector, and Charles got a holy endorsement that made him more than just a king. It made him a ruler with a God-given mission. In essence, Charlemagne was a master of the medieval balancing act. Whether it was appeasing the church, rallying his warriors, or outmanoeuvring his political rivals, Charles played the Game of Thrones long before it was a hit TV show. His early reign was a testament to his ability to navigate the complexities of his time with a mix of cunning, charisma, and perhaps a touch of sheer audacity. Charlemagne's skillful juggling act set the stage for his ambitious campaigns, which were as much about expanding borders as they were about solidifying his reputation. In 7074, Charles made a decisive move against the Lombards, spurred by a complicated cocktail of family drama and strategic necessity. You see, his ex-father-in-law, Desiderius, the king of the Lombards, wasn't exactly sending Charles Christmas cards. Desiderius was getting cozy with some of Charles's enemies, never a good look when you're trying to keep an empire intact. Now, Charles wasn't just about to let the Lombards and their fertile lands slip through his fingers. Plus, taking on the Lombards was a chance to flex his military muscles and prove to Europe that the Franks weren't just about drinking mead and telling tall tales. Charles marched his army across the Alps, a feat that was a little less epic than Hannibal's elephant parade, but still impressive. The year was 774, and his campaign against the Lombards was like a medieval road trip, complete with pit stops for the occasional skirmish. The siege of Pavia, the Lombard capital, was the crown jewel of this campaign. Charles surrounded the city with an army that was as eager for loot as it was for glory. It took months, but in June Pavia surrendered, and Charles added King of the Lombards to his ever-growing list of titles. Talk about a resume booster. He even wore the Iron Crown of Lombardy, a piece of bling allegedly made from a nail of the true cross, perfect for the medieval Instagram feed if such a thing had existed. But Charles's victory wasn't just about adding a shiny new crown to his collection. Economically, the Lombard lands were a goldmine. Rich in resources and strategically located, they provided a steady stream of revenue and a buffer against Byzantine ambitions in Italy. Charles's conquest was as much about economics as it was about ego. In a world where land equaled power, this move positioned him as a heavyweight on the European stage. Of course, not everything in Charles's military endeavours was a smashing success. Fast forward to 778, and we find him in the Pyrenees, where things didn't go quite according to plan. He was on his way home from a campaign in Spain that was meant to curb the influence of the Moors. Now, Charles wasn't exactly keen on sharing his triumphs, and his campaign in Spain was supposed to be another feather in his cap. Except this time, the feather turned out to be more like a thorn. The infamous ambush at Roncesvalles is one of those episodes that would have been a top contender for a medieval blooper reel. As Charles and his army were making their way back to Frankish lands, they were ambushed by Basque forces. It was less of a grand battle and more of a tactical embarrassment. Charles's rear guard was decimated, including the legendary Roland, who would later become the stuff of epic poetry. The Song of Roland elevated this somewhat humiliating defeat into a chivalric tragedy, complete with heroics and noble sacrifices. In reality, it was a stark reminder that even the great Charlemagne was not invincible. The Roncesvalles debacle highlighted the perils of medieval logistics, supply lines stretched thin, hostile terrain, and the unpredictable nature of local politics. It was a classic case of overextension, a tactical headache that even the best medieval aspirin couldn't cure. Yet, like any savvy leader, Charles managed to turn this setback into a lesson. He bolstered his defences and learned to better anticipate the complexities of cross-border campaigns. While Roncesvalles was a blip on the radar of his vast military exploits, it also underscored the brutal reality of medieval warfare. It wasn't all about chivalry and noble deeds. It was messy, often chaotic, and sometimes downright disastrous. Charles's campaigns were a testament to the fact that for every glorious victory there was a potential for humbling defeat lurking in the shadows. Despite the occasional misstep, Charlemagne's military strategies were largely successful, blending brute force with a keen understanding of the political landscape. His ability to adapt and learn from his mistakes was perhaps his greatest strength, ensuring that his empire not only expanded, but also endured. His reign was not merely about conquest, it was about crafting a legacy that would echo through the annals of history. And let's not forget the economic implications of his conquests. War, after all, was an expensive business. The spoils of victory provided a much-needed financial boost, funding further campaigns and the grandiose projects of his burgeoning empire. It was a cycle of conquest and consolidation, each victory fueling the next. With each new territory, Charles secured resources, manpower, and a stronger foothold in the ever-shifting landscape of medieval Europe. In essence, Charlemagne's military campaigns were a masterclass in the art of empire building. He wasn't just swinging swords and amassing lands. He was crafting a narrative, one that positioned him as a unifying force in a fragmented world. Whether through the calculated conquest of the Lombards or the lessons learned from the Roncesvalles setback, Charles demonstrated that true leadership was about more than just wielding power. It was about navigating the complex interplay of ambition, opportunity, and resilience. As Charlemagne continued to carve his legacy across the map of Europe, he laid the groundwork for a new order, one that would shape the continent for centuries to come. His campaigns were a blend of brilliance and bluster, with plenty of oops moments along the way. But beneath the armor and the crowns was a ruler who understood that the true measure of power lay not just in the lands he conquered, but in the enduring impact he left behind. And while we might chuckle at the occasional misadventure, there's no denying the indelible mark Charlemagne left on history, a testament to the enduring allure of vision, ambition, and the unyielding pursuit of greatness. Yet Charlemagne's legacy wasn't just about swinging a sword or collecting crowns like medieval Pokemon badges. Nope, our man Charles was as much a visionary as he was a conqueror, and this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Let's dive into Charlemagne the Reformer, the man who tackled chaos with a vision that would have made even a Silicon Valley entrepreneur nod in approval. You see, when Charlemagne wasn't busy expanding his empire, he was rolling up his sleeves to repair the messy, fragmented world he'd inherited. And for that he needed more than just military might. He needed a renaissance, a Carolingian renaissance to be precise. Now, before you picture toga-clad scholars reciting Latin under olive trees, let's clarify what this renaissance was all about. Unlike its Italian cousin centuries later, the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't so much a rebirth of classical wisdom, but a desperate attempt to keep the lamp of learning flickering in the Dark Ages. Imagine, if you will, a medieval start-up incubator, where monks, rather than tech bros, were the ones innovating. Charlemagne gathered the brightest minds of his time, turning monasteries into the educational powerhouses of the era. He invited scholars like Alcuin of York, think of him as the Bill Gates of monastic learning, to spearhead this intellectual revival. Charlemagne's educational reforms were like a breath of fresh air in a world suffocating under ignorance. He established schools that were open to both the sons of nobles and commoners, a radical concept in a time when education was more exclusive than a VIP club. The curriculum was a mix of religious studies and the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This was the medieval equivalent of a STEM program, minus the coding classes. Charlemagne's aim was to create a literate clergy who could read and interpret the Bible correctly, ensuring that the divine word didn't get lost in translation, literally. But let's be real for a moment. This educational overhaul wasn't just about spreading knowledge for knowledge's sake. Charlemagne understood that a well-educated clergy was essential for maintaining order and control. A literate priesthood meant a more effective administration, and in a sprawling empire that was worth its weight in gold. It was a clever move that blended altruism with pragmatism, a hallmark of Charlemagne's reign. Speaking of pragmatism, let's talk about Charlemagne's economic reforms, which were as ambitious as his military campaigns. Picture this: a medieval Europe where currency was about as reliable as a weather forecast. The economic landscape was a patchwork quilt of local currencies, each as confusing as the next. Charlemagne, with his keen eye for order, decided to standardize the currency system. He introduced the silver denarius, a coin that would become the backbone of Frankish commerce. This wasn't just a nod to Roman traditions, it was a strategic move to facilitate trade and stabilize the economy. The denarius became the gold standard, silver standard of currency, a move that would have made even the Federal Reserve nod in approval. By centralizing the minting process, Charlemagne ensured that his empire was economically cohesive, a crucial factor for its longevity. This reform wasn't just about shiny new coins, it was about creating a unified economic identity, something that was sorely lacking in the fragmented kingdoms of Europe. But, in the spirit of myth-busting, let's not paint too rosy a picture. Charlemagne's economic reforms, while visionary, weren't without their hiccups. Standardizing currency was easier said than done, and the transition was anything but smooth. The sheer logistics of replacing the myriad local currencies with a single coin was a mammoth task, and one that met with resistance from those who benefited from the existing chaos. It was a classic case of good intentions clashing with practical realities, a theme that would recur throughout Charlemagne's reign. Now, let's pivot to another one of Charlemagne's ambitious projects, legal reform. In a world where justice was often as swift and brutal as a Viking raid, Charlemagne sought to bring consistency and order to the legal system. He wasn't about to let his empire be governed by a hodgepodge of tribal laws, each as contradictory as the next. So, what did he do? He embarked on a mission to codify laws, creating a system that was as organized as it was enforceable. Charlemagne's legal reforms were like a medieval version of Apple's ecosystem, sleek, streamlined, and designed to work seamlessly across his empire. He compiled a set of capitularies, essentially royal decrees, that outlined everything from the administration of justice to the duties of royal officials. These capitularies were designed to bring uniformity to the legal system, making it easier to govern an empire that spanned thousands of miles. Yet, as with any grand reform, the devil was in the details. Implementing a uniform legal system in a culturally diverse empire was like trying to herd cats. Each region had its own traditions and customs, and not everyone was thrilled about swapping their local laws for a Frankish rulebook. Charlemagne's legal reforms were a work in progress, a testament to his visionary leadership, but also to the limits of medieval governance. And let's not overlook the human factor in all of this. Charlemagne was keenly aware that laws and decrees were only as effective as the people who enforced them. He relied on a network of local officials, the missi dominici, to oversee the administration of justice and ensure that his reforms were being implemented. These officials were like medieval quality control inspectors, tasked with keeping local lords in check and reporting back to the emperor. It was a system that blended trust with oversight, a balancing act that Charlemagne managed with remarkable skill. In the end, Charlemagne's reforms were as much about legacy as they were about governance. He wasn't just building an empire, he was crafting a narrative, one that positioned him as a ruler of order in a world of chaos. Whether through the revival of learning, the standardization of currency, or the codification of laws, Charlemagne's vision was to create a cohesive, functioning society. A society that, despite its challenges and contradictions, laid the groundwork for what would become the medieval European order. As we wrap up this chapter of Charlemagne's story, it's worth noting that his reforms, like any ambitious undertaking, were a mix of triumph and trial. They were bold, they were transformative, and they were often fraught with complexity. But above all, they were a reflection of Charlemagne's relentless drive to bring order to a world teetering on the edge of chaos. So, as we leave Charlemagne for now, remember that his legacy wasn't just carved in stone or written in the annals of history, it was etched in the very fabric of the society he helped to shape. And as we look to the next chapter of his life, we'll see how these reforms, with all their successes and shortcomings, set the stage for even greater challenges and achievements. Stay tuned for more tales of ambition, strategy, and the indomitable spirit of the man known as Charlemagne. As we dive into the next chapter of Charlemagne's saga, let's shift our gaze from the bustling corridors of his reformist agenda to the hallowed halls of Christendom. You see, in the medieval world, a ruler's power wasn't just measured by the lands he conquered or the reforms he enacted. Nope, it was also about how well he could play nice with the church, a relationship that was as complicated as a medieval soap opera with a divine twist. Now, Charlemagne wasn't just any ruler. He was a man who understood the power of a good PR campaign, especially when it involved the ultimate endorsement from above. Into the year 800 AD, a year that would forever cement Charlemagne's legacy as not just a king, but an emperor. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To truly grasp the significance of this crowning moment, we need to understand the intricate dance between Charlemagne and the papacy. Picture this. The Catholic Church, in the 8th century was a bit like a medieval United Nations, minus the peacekeeping missions and with a lot more incense. The Pope, seated in Rome, was the spiritual leader of Western Christendom, wielding influence that crossed borders and transcended politics. But make no mistake, the papacy needed a protector, someone to shield it from the geopolitical storms of the time. Enter Charlemagne, the Frankish king, with a penchant for strong-arming his way through Europe and the charisma to make it look like a godly mission. The alliance between Charlemagne and the papacy was a masterstroke of mutual benefit. For Charlemagne, it wasn't just about the heavenly brownie points. Nope, he had his eyes on the prize, a formal recognition that would elevate him from the ranks of mere kings to the status of a Roman emperor. This was a title that carried not just prestige, but a symbolic authority that harked back to the glory days of the Roman Empire. For the Pope, having Charlemagne as a protector was like having a bouncer at the gates of heaven, ready to fend off any earthly threats. Fast forward to Christmas Day, 800 AD. Charlemagne was in Rome, attending Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. It was supposed to be a regular day of worship, but Pope Leo III had other plans. In a move that was as much theatre as it was theology, the Pope placed a crown on Charlemagne's head, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. Now, whether Charlemagne was genuinely surprised by this coronation is up for debate. But let's be real. He wasn't exactly complaining. The crowning was a savvy political maneuver wrapped in divine packaging. It was as if God himself was giving Charlemagne's rule a celestial thumbs up. Yet, behind the holy veneer was a shrewd calculation. By crowning Charlemagne, the Pope was effectively asserting the power of the papacy over the imperial title, reminding everyone that no earthly ruler could stand without the blessing of the Church. It was a delicate dance of power, one that Charlemagne navigated with a mix of piety and pragmatism. Let's talk economics for a second because, surprise, surprise, divine endorsements don't pay the bills. The title of emperor wasn't just a shiny new badge for Charlemagne's collection, it came with economic implications too. An emperor needed an empire, and an empire needed resources. Charlemagne's coronation opened doors for increased trade and economic relationships, particularly with the Byzantine Empire. With the Church's backing, Charlemagne could negotiate from a position of strength, securing alliances and trade agreements that bolstered his empire's coffers. But was this crowning moment really all about divine right, or was it a calculated power play? Let's not kid ourselves. Charlemagne was a master strategist. He understood that ruling an empire wasn't just about wielding a sword, it was about wielding influence. By aligning himself with the Church, he wasn't just ensuring his place in heaven, he was securing his place in history. The crowning was as much about optics as it was about divine favor, a reminder that even the most sacred of ceremonies could be tinged with political savvy. Yet, let's not overlook the human element in all of this. Charlemagne's relationship with the Church wasn't just a transactional alliance, it was a complex, evolving partnership. He wasn't merely a puppet of the papacy, nor was he a tyrant imposing his will. Instead, he walked a tightrope, balancing the demands of the Church with the realities of ruling a sprawling empire. It was a balancing act that required both diplomacy and, when necessary, a firm grip on power. In the grand tapestry of history, Charlemagne's coronation as emperor was a turning point, a moment that reshaped the political landscape of medieval Europe. It was a fusion of the sacred and the secular, a testament to Charlemagne's vision for a unified Christendom under his rule. But it was also a reminder of the intricate power dynamics at play, the delicate dance between earthly ambition and heavenly aspiration. As we continue to unravel the tale of Charlemagne, let's keep in mind that this was a man who understood the art of the possible. Whether through military might, economic acumen, or divine endorsement, Charlemagne's reign was a masterclass in the pursuit of power. Yet, for all his achievements, his legacy was as much about the alliances he forged as it was about the battles he won. Stay tuned for more as we delve deeper into the complexities of Charlemagne's empire and the challenges that lay ahead. With each twist and turn, we'll see how this iconic ruler navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics, leaving an indelible mark on the pages of history. As Charlemagne's empire reached its zenith, the man himself was beginning to feel the weight of time, a reminder that even emperors aren't immune to the wear and tear of life. By the early 800s, the once vigorous ruler who had led countless campaigns and enacted sweeping reforms was grappling with the relentless march of age. The years of battle and the burdens of ruling a sprawling empire had taken their toll. Charlemagne was no longer the strapping king who had crossed the Alps to conquer the Lombards or the emperor crowned in the splendor of St. Peter's Basilica. He was now in his 70s, a ripe old age by medieval standards, where the average life expectancy hovered around the mid-40s if you were lucky. But let's not picture him as a frail old man just yet. Charlemagne remained a formidable presence, still sharp and engaged, albeit with a few more aches and pains than he probably liked to admit. His decline wasn't just physical. As he aged, the emperor faced the daunting task of ensuring that his life's work wouldn't unravel the moment he shuffled off this mortal coil. Because, let's face it, history is littered with the ruins of empires that crumbled faster than a house of cards the minute their mighty architects exited stage left. The year was 813, and Charlemagne had to make a crucial decision: how to secure his empire's future. His solution? Crown his sole surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious, as co-emperor? Yes, the Pious. While it might sound like Louis was destined to be the kind of guy who'd rather be in church than on a battlefield, his nickname was more about his devout nature than any lack of ambition. Charlemagne's empire was vast, stretching from the Pyrenees to the Danube, encompassing modern-day France, Germany, Italy, and beyond. It was a patchwork of cultures, languages, and loyalties, held together by one man's vision. And that man knew he couldn't leave this delicate tapestry in the hands of just anyone. In a private ceremony in Aachen, Charlemagne placed a crown on Louis's head, a symbolic gesture that was as much about continuity as it was about control. By doing so, Charlemagne was saying, "This is the guy, folks. Keep everything running smoothly, okay?" It was a passing of the torch, an attempt to maintain stability in an empire that had known more than its fair share of upheaval. But let's not kid ourselves. Charlemagne's empire was no well-oiled machine. It was more like a rickety wagon held together by sheer willpower and a few well-placed nails. The succession plan, though logical, wasn't foolproof. Medieval politics were as predictable as a cat on a hot tin roof, and the question of inheritance was a perennial powder keg. You see, dividing an empire among heirs was a tradition that had more in common with a game of musical chairs than a strategic succession plan. History had shown that even the most carefully laid plans could be undone by sibling rivalry and ambition. And so, on January 28, 814, Charlemagne breathed his last in the palace at Aachen. He was 71, a venerable age that made him a veritable Methuselah by the standards of his time. His death marked the end of an era, the closing chapter of a life that had reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Europe. Charlemagne was buried in Aachen Cathedral, laid to rest in a sarcophagus that might have been Roman or maybe just inspired by Roman grandeur. The details are as murky as the Rhine in winter. With Charlemagne gone, the empire was left in Louis's hands, but the transition was anything but smooth. The empire's vastness, once a testament to Charlemagne's ambition, now became its greatest vulnerability. In 807, just 3 years into his reign, Louis attempted to address this by dividing the empire among his 3 sons, Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German. The plan, known as the Ordinatio Imperii, was meant to ensure that each son had a piece of the imperial pie to govern. Spoiler alert, it didn't go exactly as planned. You see, if history has taught us anything, it's that dividing an empire is like splitting a pizza among siblings. Someone's always going to feel shortchanged. The division sowed the seeds of discord, setting the stage for future conflicts that would fracture the empire beyond repair. Fast forward to the Treaty of Verdun in 843, and you'll find the once mighty Carolingian Empire carved into 3 distinct realms, a shadow of its former glory. And so, Charlemagne's legacy became a tale of 2 extremes, grand achievements and epic blunders. On one hand, he was the father of Europe, a visionary who sought to unite a fractured continent under a banner of learning, culture, and faith. On the other, he was a man whose empire was as fragile as the parchment its laws were written on, vulnerable to the very human flaws of ambition and rivalry. Charlemagne's life and legacy remind us that history is rarely black and white. It's a kaleidoscope of triumphs and trials, where the line between success and failure is often as thin as a strand of medieval parchment. He was a man of his time, yet his influence stretched far beyond it, shaping the course of European history in ways that continue to resonate today. So, as we wrap up our journey through the life of Charlemagne, let's remember that his story is one of complexity and contradiction. He was a ruler who dared to dream big, whose ambitions were as vast as the lands he ruled. Yet, he was also a man who grappled with the same limitations and uncertainties that have plagued leaders throughout history. Charlemagne's legacy is a testament to the enduring allure of vision and the sobering reality of human frailty, a reminder that even the greatest empires are built on the shifting sands of time. In the land of dust and legends, where rivers with names as evocative as the Tigris and Euphrates meandered through the Fertile Crescent, ancient Sumer was the bustling epicenter of civilization around 3500 BCE. Picture it. Or rather, don't picture it, because that would be a cliché. This was a world where cuneiform tablets were the hottest tech, the Sumerian version of Instagram without the selfies. Life was a tapestry of clay tablets and trade routes, a network without the internet, yet they managed to stay connected, like a modern-day group chat on dial-up. Sumer, located in what we now call southern Iraq, wasn't just a spot on the map, it was the Silicon Valley of antiquity. Here they invented writing, which was basically the ancient equivalent of keyboards and smartphones. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Sumerians weren't writing love sonnets or epic novels. Their scribes were more concerned with keeping tabs on grain inventories and trade agreements. It was less to be or not to be, and more 2 goats for 1 sack of barley. The geography of Sumer was a mixed blessing. The region was blessed with rich soil, courtesy of the silt deposited by the 2 great rivers, but cursed with the kind of heat that could bake an egg on a stone. This fertile ground was the breadbasket that fed the city-states like Uruk, and Lagash. These weren't cities in the modern sense, but more like sprawling complexes of ziggurats, homes, and markets, buzzing with activity like a beehive on caffeine. Trade was the lifeblood of Sumer, and their merchants were the rock stars of their time, navigating the trade routes that stretched as far as the Indus Valley and Anatolia. Forget the Silk Road, we're talking copper, tin, and lapis lazuli. Luxury goods that made even the most mundane labourer feel a little bit like royalty. The Sumerians bartered their surplus grain and textiles for metals and stones, building a commercial empire without the luxury of GPS or Google Maps. Instead, they relied on the stars and a healthy dose of courage. The invention of writing around 3200 BCE was a game-changer, akin to the invention of the Internet in our era. It started with simple pictographs, but soon evolved into a full-fledged script known as cuneiform. Imagine accounting spreadsheets but on clay tablets. The Sumerians didn't have emojis, but they did have a symbol for everything from sheep to the goddess Inanna, ensuring that no detail of daily life was left undocumented. These tablets were the original tweets, albeit ones you couldn't delete when you regretted them. In a society where oral tradition was king, writing was revolutionary. It allowed for the storage and transmission of knowledge across generations, ensuring that the wisdom of the past wasn't lost to the ravages of time. Their libraries weren't filled with tales of fiction, but with practical records, contracts, inventories, and legal codes. It was bureaucracy in its infancy, a testament to their organizational prowess. Sumerian society thrived on this interconnectedness. They didn't have internet trolls, but they did have lively debates, often held in the shadow of their ziggurats. These massive, tiered structures served as both religious centers and community hubs, where priests doubled as early influencers, controlling not just the spiritual but also the economic life of the city-states. Priests and merchants were the power players, the ancient equivalent of politicians and CEOs. Now, speaking of myths, let's debunk a few. The romantic image of ancient Sumer as a utopia of wisdom and peace is just that, a romantic image. Sure, they gave us writing and the wheel, but they also had their fair share of wars, power struggles, and societal inequalities. The city-states were often at each other's throats, vying for control over land and resources, much like siblings fighting over the last slice of pizza. These conflicts were recorded in their tablets, which might as well have been titled Game of Thrones, the Sumerian edition. But why did these things matter? The technological and cultural advances of Sumer laid the groundwork for civilizations to come. Their innovations in agriculture, writing, and trade set the stage for the development of complex societies. They proved that human beings could not only survive in challenging environments but thrive, creating a legacy that would echo through the corridors of history. In this ancient world, where the only stars were in the sky and not on the silver screen, the Sumerians connected across vast distances, traded, wrote, and occasionally fought. It was a tapestry of ambition and invention, a narrative rich with the kind of stories that would keep any historian up at night, marveling at how much we owe to those who came before us, and how, in some ways, we haven't changed all that much. Now, let's dive into the diplomatic drama that unfolded across the dusty plains of ancient Sumer. Forget Hollywood thrillers, these city-states had all the intrigue you could ask for, minus the popcorn. In a world where GPS meant guessing position by stars, and FaceTime was a literal face-to-face meeting, the Sumerians were already masters of diplomacy, crafting alliances and forging treaties like pros. Picture this: Uruk and Ur, two of the heavyweights in the Sumerian League of City-States, were not just competitors on the trade routes, they were also frenemies on the political stage. Diplomacy in Sumer wasn't just about polite pleasantries and firm handshakes. It was a theatrical performance, complete with lavish gifts and elaborate ceremonies. The Sumerians knew that a well-timed gift could speak louder than words, especially when those words were etched into clay tablets. We're talking luxury items like lapis lazuli, gold, fine wool, and, of course, the kind of grain that could keep a city fed through a bad harvest. These gifts were the ancient equivalent of likes and shares, a way to maintain alliances and keep the peace. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The stakes were high, and so were the tensions. Sometimes a gift was just a gift, but often it was a bribe, a payoff, or an apology wrapped in a pretty package. Now, let's talk about the real heroes of Sumerian diplomacy, the scribes. These were the original spin doctors, the PR maestros of the ancient world. Armed with their styluses and clay tablets, they crafted messages that could sway opinions and seal deals. Imagine them as the proto-political advisors, writing speeches and drafting treaties that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. In a place where the written word was sacred, these scribes wielded power that went beyond mere documentation. The art of persuasion was their domain, and they knew how to navigate the labyrinth of political alliances like seasoned pros. Diplomatic correspondences were often as much about what wasn't said as what was. Subtlety was key, and reading between the lines was an essential skill for anyone involved in the politics of ancient Sumer. Envoys too played a pivotal role, acting as the human links between city-states. These individuals were chosen not just for their negotiation skills, but for their ability to survive the perilous journeys that diplomacy often required. Travel wasn't just a matter of hopping on a flight. It meant weeks, if not months, of trekking through hostile territories, all while ensuring that the wrong word didn't spark a war. The Sumerian concept of diplomacy was a delicate dance of give and take, of threats and promises, all conducted under the ever-watchful eyes of the gods. These celestial beings were believed to be deeply invested in the affairs of mortals, and every agreement was made with a nod to their divine will. The Sumerians understood that a treaty wasn't just a piece of paper, or clay in their case, but a sacred contract, one that carried the weight of divine retribution if broken. Now, let's debunk the myth of Sumerian diplomacy as a purely noble pursuit of peace. Sure, they were pioneers of international relations, but their motives were as self-interested as any modern state. Peace was often a means to an end, a tool to secure resources, stabilize trade routes, or consolidate power. The first international treaties, like those between Lagash and Umma, were as much about avoiding costly wars as they were about establishing long-term harmony. The Treaty of Mesalam, for example, wasn't just a friendly handshake. It was a strategic maneuver to delineate territories and prevent constant skirmishes. This treaty, dating back to around 2550 BCE, was one of the earliest recorded agreements of its kind, a precursor to the complex international laws we know today. It was a practical solution to a perennial problem: how to live next door to rivals without constant bloodshed. Sumerian diplomacy was an art form honed over centuries of trial and error. It was a world where words could build bridges or burn them, where a single misstep could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. In this ancient Game of Thrones, the stakes were high, and the players were as cunning as they come. The Sumerians may not have had LinkedIn, but they understood the power of networking long before it became a corporate buzzword. In the end, the real genius of Sumerian diplomacy lay in its adaptability. They were quick to learn that in the ever-shifting sands of political power, flexibility was key. They mastered the art of balancing strength with subtlety, of wielding influence with finesse. Their legacy isn't just in the treaties they forged or the alliances they built, but in the very concept of diplomacy itself. So the next time you hear about a high-stakes negotiation or a complex peace treaty, remember the Sumerians. They were the original masters of the diplomatic arts, crafting a legacy that echoes through the corridors of history. And while their world may seem distant and alien, their stories remind us that the human quest for peace and power is as old as civilization itself. Keep your ears open and your clay tablets ready, for the saga of Sumer is far from over. But before we dive headfirst into the legal labyrinth of the Code of Ur-Nammu, let's clear up a common misconception. Ancient Sumer wasn't a land of perpetual harmony where everyone agreed to disagree with a dignified handshake. Oh no, this was a world where city-states could make Machiavelli look like a choir boy. The Sumerians played power games with the same fervor they reserved for their religious rituals, and the stakes? Well, they were higher than a ziggurat in moonlight. Enter the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest known legal code, written around 2010 BCE, a good 300 years before Hammurabi decided to carve his laws onto a stone stele and become the ancient poster boy for justice. Think of Ur-Nammu's code as the Sumerian attempt to lay down the law, literally. Comprised of around 57 laws, this code wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was about keeping the rulers in power and the rabble in line. It was a masterstroke of political maneuvering cloaked in the guise of justice. Now, let's talk numbers. The Code of Ur-Nammu dealt with everything from marriage and slavery to personal injury, and it did so with a precision that would make a modern lawyer blush. For instance, if someone committed murder, they'd face the death penalty, a rather straightforward approach to law enforcement. But if a man were to cut off another man's foot, the offending party would pay 10 shekels of silver. That's right, Sumerians had a price list for body parts, which was probably the ancient equivalent of a medical billing statement. But why was this legal framework such a big deal? Well, Sumerian society was a pottery of city-states, each with its own ambitions and grievances. The Code of Ur-Nammu wasn't just about laying down the law, it was about standardizing it across regions, creating a semblance of unity in a world that was anything but. It was a way for the rulers of Ur to extend their influence, ensuring that everyone played by the same rules, or at least paid the same fines. The legal framework was also a diplomatic tool par excellence. When city-states like Ur and Lagash were at loggerheads over territory or trade routes, a mutually recognized set of laws provided a baseline for negotiations. It was like everyone agreeing to play Monopoly with the same rulebook, except the stakes were land, resources, and often human lives. The laws themselves became bargaining chips in the high-stakes poker game of Sumerian diplomacy. And speaking of high stakes, let's dive into some juicy historical gossip. Picture this, a power struggle between Ur and Lagash that could rival any modern political scandal. On the surface, it seemed like a simple territorial dispute, but beneath, it was a tangled web of alliances and betrayals. At one point, the king of Lagash, Eonatum, even claimed a divine mandate to expand his city-state's borders, a claim that raised more than a few eyebrows and probably led to some spirited debates over ancient ales. The backstabbing wasn't confined to the battlefield. In the political arena, rulers would employ espionage and subterfuge to outmaneuver rivals. Think of it as Game of Thrones minus the dragons and with more clay tablets. Alliances were as fragile as a Sumerian vase, often sealed with marriages between the elite families. But these unions were less about love and more about strategic positioning, a lesson in realpolitik that would make even the most jaded modern diplomat nod in recognition. And let's not forget the role of the gods in these power plays. Every decision, every alliance, every betrayal was made with one eye on the heavens. The gods were the ultimate referees, and their favor was a currency more valuable than silver or barley. If a ruler found themselves on the losing side of a conflict, it was often interpreted as divine disfavor, a convenient way to shift the blame from human incompetence to celestial caprice. Now, it's time to debunk a myth that's as persistent as a mosquito on a summer night, the idea that the Sumerians were a peace-loving people who invented diplomacy out of sheer goodwill. Sure, they were pioneers of international relations, but let's be real, they were just as self-serving as any state actor today. Their legal codes and diplomatic maneuvers were less about altruism and more about securing power and resources. The code of Ur-Nammu didn't just keep the peace, it kept Ur in a position of dominance, a tidy little arrangement for those at the top. The Sumerian power plays were a testament to the fact that human nature hasn't changed all that much over the millennia. Sure, we've swapped clay tablets for digital devices and ziggurats for skyscrapers, but the underlying dynamics of power and politics remain eerily similar. The Sumerians understood that in the game of power, the rules are always changing, and the players must adapt or perish. So, as we wrap up this installment of Sumerian intrigue, remember, the next time you hear about a political scandal, a diplomatic spat, or a legal maneuver that seems too cunning to be true, it's likely just the latest chapter in a story as old as civilization itself. Stay tuned, because the saga continues, and the next act promises even more twists and turns. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. And so, as we delve deeper into the epic saga of Sumer, where power was brokered with the same reverence as religious rites, let's pivot to our unsung heroes, the diplomats. These were the real MVPs of ancient geopolitics, tasked with the Herculean challenge of keeping peace among city-states that squabbled more often than siblings over the last slice of cake. First on the list of their Herculean labours? Linguistic barriers. Now, you might think, how hard could it be? They all spoke Sumerian, right? Not quite. Even within the Sumerian heartland, dialects varied, like modern-day accents of English, from the Queen's pristine pronunciation to the southern drawl. Imagine trying to negotiate a peace treaty when peace in one dialect might sound suspiciously like peace in another, and you can see why misunderstandings abounded. And let's not forget the Akkadians, who were the pesky neighbours with their own language, lurking just north of the Sumerian territories. The diplomats of Sumer had to be linguistic acrobats, flipping between tongues like they were auditioning for a multilingual Cirque du Soleil. They were the ancient Rosetta Stones, crucial in decoding the intricate dance of diplomacy. Next up, the perilous business of long-distance communication. Forget about firing off a quick email or sliding into someone's DMs. In the world of Sumer, sending a message was more akin to launching a message in a bottle, except the ocean was a desert and the bottle was a clay tablet. A diplomatic envoy would take weeks, sometimes months, to traverse the treacherous trade routes, dodging bandits, wild animals, and the occasional dust storm that could turn a sunny day into a scene from a disaster movie. These envoys were the original road warriors. Armed with nothing but their wits, a stylus, and a prayer to the gods, they braved the network of paths that connected the city-states like a spider's web. It was the ultimate test of endurance and diplomacy, ensuring that by the time the tablet reached its destination, the news wasn't already yesterday's fish wrap. And speaking of threats, let's talk about the ever-present shadow of invasion. Sumer was like the prime piece of real estate that everyone wanted. With its fertile lands and strategic position, it was a tempting target for neighbouring tribes and city-states. The diplomats were constantly playing a high-stakes game of chess, anticipating moves and countering threats long before they materialized. The Akkadians, Elamites and Gutians were a constant thorn in their side, always ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. Sumerian diplomats had to be as cunning as they were charming, negotiating alliances and treaties that could ward off these would-be invaders. They were the original spin doctors, turning potential disaster into diplomatic opportunity. And let's not forget the gods, those celestial overlords who were as moody as a teenager on a bad hair day. Every diplomatic decision was carefully weighed against the whims of the divine. A bad harvest? Clearly, the gods were displeased, and it was up to the diplomats to appease them with offerings and prayers. The gods were the ultimate referees, and keeping them happy was as crucial as any treaty. Now, you might be thinking, surely these diplomats were revered for their efforts? Not exactly. While they were respected, they were also viewed with suspicion. After all, these were the folks who mingled with the enemy, and trust was a rare commodity in the cutthroat world of Sumerian politics. They walked a tightrope of allegiances, always one misstep away from falling out of favor. So, what can we learn from these ancient emissaries? Quite a bit, actually. The challenges they faced, language barriers, communication hurdles, constant threats, are not so different from the ones diplomats grapple with today. Sure, we've swapped clay tablets for encrypted emails and caravans for jumbo jets, but the essence of diplomacy remains the same. The delicate dance of negotiation, the art of compromise, the constant balancing act of power and peace. The Sumerians were pioneers, blazing a trail in international relations that would shape the world for millennia. Their legacy is a testament to the timeless nature of diplomacy, a reminder that even in the most fractious of times, the pen or stylus is mightier than the sword. So, as we close this chapter on the diplomatic escapades of Sumer, remember that the next time you hear about a high-stakes negotiation or a peace treaty hashed out in a windowless room, you're witnessing the latest act in a story that began thousands of years ago in the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. Stay tuned, because the Sumerian saga is far from over, and the next installment promises even more intrigue. And speaking of the Sumerian saga, let's lay out the blueprint of their diplomatic legacy and see just how these ancient strategists left an indelible mark on the world stage. In the dusty halls of history, Sumerian diplomacy stands as a testament to the timeless art of negotiation, a skill as relevant today as it was when the first clay tablet was etched with a treaty. They didn't just lay the foundation for international relations, they practically invented the concept, crafting a diplomatic playbook that's still in use, albeit with a few modern updates. You see, the Sumerians had this uncanny ability to juggle peace and power with the finesse of a circus performer. They pioneered the use of treaties, those ancient contracts written in cuneiform that would make any lawyer today swoon. The Treaty of Misled, for instance, wasn't just a simple agreement, it was a groundbreaking document that set territorial boundaries and established a framework for resolving disputes without resorting to the kind of all-out brawls that would make a WWE match look tame. This treaty, inked, or rather, impressed, around 2550 BCE, was like the Magna Carta of its day, a precursor to the complex web of international law that governs our world now. Now, let's talk about their knack for alliances. The Sumerians knew that in the cutthroat world of city-states, going it alone was a recipe for disaster. They mastered the art of forming strategic partnerships, whether through marriage alliances or trade agreements, weaving a web of interdependence that was as intricate as the finest Sumerian tapestry. This wasn't just about making friends. It was about ensuring survival in a landscape where allies today could be adversaries tomorrow, depending on which way the political wind blew. And here's a juicy tidbit. The Sumerians were among the first to recognize the power of economic diplomacy. Sure, they didn't have the World Trade Organization, but they understood that controlling trade routes was as powerful as wielding an army. They bartered grain for metals and textiles for luxury goods, creating a network of commerce that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Indus Valley. This wasn't just trade. It was a strategic maneuver to ensure that even if swords were drawn, the coffers remained full. A lesson in economic resilience that modern economies would do well to remember. But let's not gloss over their blunders. Not every Sumerian diplomatic effort was a home run. Their alliances were sometimes as stable as a sandcastle in a storm, prone to collapse under the weight of ambition and betrayal. The city-states were often embroiled in conflicts that were as much about ego as they were about resources. It's a reminder that while diplomacy can be a powerful tool, it's only as effective as the people wielding it. The Sumerians, like us, had their fair share of missteps, from poorly timed alliances to treaties that failed to prevent bloodshed. However, despite these hiccups, the Sumerians left an enduring legacy. Their diplomatic innovations laid the groundwork for what we now consider the standard operating procedures of international relations. The idea of using dialogue to resolve conflicts, of balancing power through alliances, and of leveraging economic ties to maintain peace are all concepts that trace their lineage back to the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. And let's not forget the art of persuasion. The Sumerians were masters of the subtle nudge, the gentle push that could sway a rival city-state from hostility to harmony. Their scribes were the original PR professionals, crafting messages that could calm tensions and forge connections. This wasn't just about writing. It was about understanding human nature, about knowing that sometimes a well-placed word can do more than 1,000 swords. So, why does all this matter? In a world where headlines are dominated by diplomatic spats and international negotiations, the Sumerian legacy offers a blueprint for how to navigate the complex web of global relations. They remind us that diplomacy isn't just the stuff of grand speeches and high-stakes summits, it's the everyday work of building bridges, of finding common ground in a landscape that's often divided by walls, both literal and metaphorical. The Sumerians taught us that diplomacy is an art, one that requires patience, skill, and a keen understanding of the human heart. They showed us that peace isn't just the absence of war, but the presence of justice and cooperation. And in their story, we find echoes of our own, a reminder that while times change, the challenges of diplomacy remain as ancient and enduring as the stars that once guided Sumerian envoys across the desert. So, as we draw the curtain on this chapter of history, let's take a moment to appreciate the giants on whose shoulders we stand. The Sumerians were more than just the architects of civilization. They were the original diplomats, the pioneers of peace in a world that was anything but peaceful. Their legacy is a testament to the power of the human spirit, to forge connections, to build alliances, and to seek understanding in the face of division. And as we look to the future, let's carry forward the lessons of Sumer, that diplomacy is not a relic of the past, but a living, breathing art that continues to shape our world. In the end, the Sumerians remind us that the quest for peace and understanding is as ancient as civilization itself, and that, perhaps, is their greatest legacy. If you were a kid in 15th century Saxony, Germany, there were two things you knew to fear: thunderstorms and saints with tempers. And, if you were Martin Luther, you got a double dose of both. Young Martin was born on November 10th, 1483, in the town of Eilben, a place where the skies seemed to crack open with every mood swing of the heavens. His father, Hans Luther, was a copper miner and smelter who had big dreams for his son. Dreams that did not involve getting drenched in celestial spit every time it stormed. Luther's upbringing was the kind that gave medieval parenting its rough reputation. Discipline was strict, and fear was a parenting tool as common as porridge. Little Martin was no stranger to the rod, especially when his father imagined him as the future family lawyer. Forget tough love, think more along the lines of terrifying love. His mother, Margaretha, was equally stern, reportedly disciplining him for stealing a single nut. Not exactly the Brady Bunch, right? And then there were the saints. In Luther's world, saints were less like benevolent guardians and more like celestial enforcers. The family was devoutly Catholic, and Martin was taught to invoke saints for protection and guidance. But it wasn't all sunshine and halos. These were saints who could also strike you down with boils for misbehaving. For a kid like Martin, it was a choose-your-own adventure of divine retribution. Now, you've probably heard the tale about how a bolt of lightning changed Luther's life forever. Picture this: a young Martin caught in a storm in 1505, lightning crashing down around him, and in a moment of terror he vows to St. Anne that he'll become a monk if he survives. It's a great story, except it's not the whole truth. Sure, he was afraid of storms, but the decision to join a monastery had more layers than a medieval onion. The real story is all about pressure, both from the heavens and the household. By 1505, Martin was attending the University of Erfurt, a place so prestigious it was nicknamed the German Rome. He was on the fast track to becoming a lawyer, just like his dad wanted, but the pressure was mounting. The legal path wasn't exactly Luther's dream gig. He was more interested in questions of faith and the human soul than in courtrooms and contracts. And then there was the whole fear of hell thing. Martin was what you might call a hypochondriac for the soul. The Catholic Church taught that salvation wasn't a given, and Martin was terrified of eternal damnation. His spiritual anxiety, combined with the academic stress and family expectations, made Luther a ticking time bomb of existential dread. So, when that infamous storm rolled in, it wasn't just about the lightning. It was about a young man caught in the eye of a storm of expectations, fears, and spiritual crises. The decision to join the Augustinian monastery was less a spontaneous vow and more a culmination of years of internal struggle. It was the ultimate "I need a change" moment, medieval style. But let's not romanticize the monastery as some serene retreat. Luther entered the Augustinian order in Erfurt, where life was as austere as it gets. Monastic life was a rigorous mix of prayer, work, and study. It was here that Luther began to delve into the scriptures with a fervour that would later fuel his revolutionary ideas. He was ordained as a priest in 1507, and by 1508 he was already lecturing on theology at the University of Wittenberg. So why does this part of Luther's life matter? Because it sets the stage for everything that comes next. Luther's early experiences with fear, authority, and the search for spiritual certainty would shape his later challenges to the Church. They were the kindling for the fire that would eventually ignite the Reformation. But before he could nail those 95 theses to the door, he had to navigate the storms, both literal and metaphorical, that marked his early years. In a world where saints wielded both blessings and fireballs, Martin Luther was a man caught between fear and faith. His journey into monastic life wasn't a flight of fancy inspired by a lightning bolt, but rather a leap into the unknown, driven by deep-seated fears and a yearning for spiritual peace. Little did he know, the storm was just beginning. So, there's Martin Luther, just a young man in a monastery, probably wondering how he got there and, more importantly, how he was going to survive the strict routines and spiritual boot camp that was monastic life. The Augustinian monastery wasn't exactly a club med for the soul. It was more like a medieval version of Survivor, minus the tiki torches and tribal council. You had your daily prayers, your manual labour, and your meals that were as exciting as boiled shoes. But for Luther, this was a place to wrestle with the big questions, like the kind that keep you up at night staring at the ceiling. And wrestle he did. Martin was obsessed with the idea of salvation, and his spiritual anxiety was the kind that could put a hypochondriac to shame. In the monastery, he was like a sponge, soaking up theological teachings and trying to squeeze out some understanding of his own spiritual state. He confessed his sins with such frequency and fervour that his confessor, Staupitz, reportedly told him to go commit some real sins to have something worth confessing. Imagine being so worried about your soul that your confessor basically tells you to chill out. But while Luther was busy confessing anything from minor fibs to the deep recesses of his soul, something else was brewing. He had started teaching at the University of Wittenberg by 1508. Now, let's set the scene here. Wittenberg wasn't exactly the Harvard of its time. It was more like the scrappy upstart school, the kind that's just itching to prove its mettle. And Luther? He was the guy who was going to help put it on the map. Teaching there, he began to dive into the scriptures with a fervour that would make even the most pious monk look like a weekend warrior. Luther was a natural at questioning authority, a trait that probably made him a nightmare to any strict disciplinarian. But at Wittenberg, it was his superpower. He began to develop ideas that were, let's say, not exactly mainstream. His knack for questioning wasn't just a rebellious streak. It was a full-blown intellectual quest, fueled by the belief that everyone was getting it wrong. He started to see the Bible not as a book of past prescriptions, but as a living text with truths that challenged the status quo. And then came the indulgences. Ah, yes, those infamous tickets to heaven. The Church sold these indulgences as a way to reduce time in purgatory, for a hefty sum, of course. It was like a spiritual layaway plan, but for your soul. The practice was as popular as it was lucrative. Essentially a divine crowdfunding campaign to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. And while it might sound like a medieval infomercial. But wait, there's more. Buy now and save your great aunt twice removed. It was a serious cash cow for the Church. Luther saw this and thought, hold on a minute, where's that in the Bible? Spoiler alert, it's not. The indulgence trade was less about penance and more about profits, and Luther, with his keen sense of justice and a growing distaste for religious exploitation, was not going to let this slide. By 1517, Luther had had enough. He penned the 95 Theses, a document that was essentially a medieval mic drop, and he didn't hold back, laying out problem after problem with the Church's practices. The 95 Theses were nailed to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517. Think of it as the world's first viral post, except instead of Instagram, it was the church door, and instead of likes, he got a summons. Luther's theses criticized the sale of indulgences, calling out their lack of scriptural support and questioning the Pope's authority to forgive sins. It was a bold move, akin to walking into a lion's den with a stake strapped to your back. Now, Let's bust a myth here. The 95 Theses didn't start a revolution overnight. They weren't an instant bestseller, and Luther wasn't hailed as a hero from day one. In fact, many people didn't even know what he was talking about, thanks to the fact that they were written in Latin. But the Theses resonated with those who were fed up with the Church's excesses, and thanks to the Gutenberg press, which was the 16th century equivalent of going viral on TikTok, these ideas spread faster than a cat video. Luther's knack for stirring the pot didn't stop there. He continued to lecture and write, questioning not just indulgences, but the very foundation of church authority. In essence, he was asking, "Who says?" when it came to religious doctrine, and people started paying attention. He argued that salvation was by faith alone, sola fide, as the Latin goes, and not by purchasing your way into heaven. As Luther's ideas spread, they caught fire in a Europe ripe for change. The social and economic context was perfect for a shake-up. The church was rich and powerful, but ordinary people were struggling. Indulgences felt like a tax on the poor, and Luther's message hit home. This wasn't just about theology, it was about fairness and justice, concepts that resonate in any era. So, there you have it, Luther, the monk who questioned everything and set the stage for a religious revolution. His time in the monastery was not just a period of spiritual struggle, but the crucible in which his reformist ideas were forged. And as he stood at the cusp of challenging the most powerful institution in Europe, one thing was clear: Martin Luther was just getting started. The storm he had entered as a young man was now a gale-force wind of change, and there was no telling where it would lead. Just as Luther was cranking up the volume on what would become one of history's most famous protest anthems, Europe was dancing to its own chaotic tune. The early 16th century was like a Renaissance fair on steroids, with political and economic currents swirling more fiercely than a medieval jousting match. Princes and popes were the kings of this chaotic chessboard, shuffling allegiances like a deck of cards and playing power games that made Game of Thrones look like a Sunday picnic. Let's start with the big players. The Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork quilt of territories that was as coherent as a dream after too much wine. It was a political Frankenstein stitched together from over 300 semi-autonomous regions, each with its own agenda and a ruler ready to go to bat for their turf. The Emperor, Charles V, wore the crown, but with that many cooks in the kitchen, his authority was as shaky as a Jenga tower in a windstorm. Enter Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. Now, Frederick was no ordinary noble. He was Luther's protector and a key player in this high-stakes Game of Thrones. He had a soft spot for relics and a knack for political savvy that would make Machiavelli proud. Owning one of the largest collections of saintly remains, Frederick was already a heavyweight in the religious scene. But he wasn't just about collecting bones, he also had a keen eye on the balance of power. Supporting Luther wasn't just a spiritual stance, it was a strategic maneuver in the ongoing tug-of-war between secular rulers and the papacy. Speaking of the papacy, let's talk about Pope Leo V, a Medici who treated the Vatican like his personal art gallery. He was more interested in the Renaissance than reform, spending lavishly to turn Rome into a cultural mecca. But here's the kicker: all that splendor didn't come cheap. The Church was essentially running a divine Kickstarter campaign to fund these grand projects, with indulgences as the main reward tier. This financial alchemy turned spiritual forgiveness into cold, hard cash, lining the Vatican's coffers while leaving everyday believers short-changed. Luther's 95 Theses hit the scene like a splash of ice water to the face. His arguments cut through the noise, exposing indulgences for what they were, a cash grab disguised as piety. And once the printing press got hold of his ideas, it was all over. Imagine the 16th century equivalent of a tweet storm. Luther's ideas spread faster than you could say Reformation. Thanks to the press, his message leaped from Wittenberg to every corner of Europe, igniting debates and drawing supporters like moths to a theological flame. But let's throw a wrench into the romanticized image of Luther as a lone monk battling the monolithic church. Sure, he was the poster child for reform, but this was no one-man show. He had allies, powerful ones. Princes like Frederick saw Luther's rebellion as a chance to assert their autonomy against both the emperor and the pope. For them, this was as much about politics as it was about faith, a convenient fusion of spiritual and secular interests. By supporting Luther, they could resist imperial control while scoring points with their more devout subjects. And then there were the economic realities. Europe was undergoing seismic shifts. The rise of capitalism, the decline of feudalism, and the growth of cities created a new class of merchants and artisans who weren't thrilled about their hard-earned coin ending up in Rome. For them, Luther's critique of church wealth and corruption was music to their ears. They saw the Reformation not just as a religious movement, but as a chance to reshape the economic landscape to better suit their emerging interests. So, Luther's ideas were fuel for a fire that was already smouldering. The Church's practice of selling indulgences was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, the tensions between rising local powers and the overarching authority of Rome were bubbling up, ready to erupt. And erupt they did, as Luther's theses became a rallying cry for those frustrated by the status quo. This wasn't just a theological debate, it was a full-blown cultural revolution. The Reformation was as much about identity and power as it was about doctrine, reshaping everything from political boundaries to personal beliefs. The world was changing, and Luther's challenge to the Church was the spark that set centuries of pent-up discontent ablaze. But let's not kid ourselves into thinking this was a peaceful transition. The Reformation unleashed a wave of religious conflict that would sweep across Europe like a raging tempest. As Luther's ideas took root, they splintered into new sects and interpretations, each with its own vision of what reform should look like. The Catholic Church, eager to defend its turf, launched the Counter-Reformation, a spiritual offensive aimed at reclaiming the faithful and reinforcing papal authority. In the midst of all this chaos, Luther himself became a lightning rod for controversy. He was excommunicated in 1521, a move that was as politically charged as it was spiritual. The Diet of Worms, a grand assembly of the empire, summoned Luther to recant his teachings. But Luther, never one to back down from a challenge, stood firm. With the eyes of Europe upon him, he refused to recant, famously declaring, "Here I stand, I can do no other." It was a defining moment, a bold stand against the entrenched powers of his day. And what about the fallout? The Reformation sparked a series of conflicts that would reshape Europe's political and religious landscape. The Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 saw thousands of German peasants rise up, inspired in part by Luther's call for reform. But Luther, ever the pragmatist, condemned the rebellion, siding with the princes to maintain order and stability. As the dust settled, Europe found itself divided between Protestant and Catholic regions, a schism that would fuel tensions for centuries to come. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 attempted to quell the unrest, allowing princes to choose the religion of their own territories. But this was a patch, not a solution, and the 30 Years' War loomed on the horizon, a brutal conflict that would engulf the continent and redefine the balance of power. So there you have it, a whirlwind tour of the political and economic climate of early 16th century Europe, where Martin Luther wasn't just a monk with a bone to pick, but a catalyst for change in a world on the brink of transformation. His ideas ricocheted through the corridors of power, prompting alliances and enmities that would shape the course of history. And while the Reformation might have started with a monk and a door, it was the collective cry of a continent ready for change that turned it into a movement. As the embers of Luther's theological rebellion continued to glow, his personal life took a surprising turn that would make even the most devoted romantic raise an eyebrow. Enter Katharina von Bora, a former nun who wasn't just content with the cloistered life. Katharina and Luther's paths crossed in 1525, not through a matchmaking service, but through a daring nun escape plan that could rival any medieval action flick. These renegade nuns, including Katharina, had fled their convent in fish barrels? Yes, you heard right, fish barrels, seeking freedom and a chance to embrace Luther's radical ideas of reform. Katharina, in particular, was more than just a footnote in Luther's saga. She was a force of nature, with her own ideas about what reform should look like, starting with household chores. Imagine the domestic scene, Luther, the fiery reformer, suddenly thrust into the role of a husband in a household that thrived on his wife's practical genius. Katharina was no passive partner. She took charge of their household, managing the finances, raising their 6 children, and running a boarding house for students, all while brewing beer that was reportedly better than the local tavern's best. Talk about a multitasker. Luther may have been the theological heavyweight, but Katharina was the backbone of the family, bringing a dose of reality to the reformer's life. While Luther penned treatises on faith, Katharina was the one keeping the lights on, literally, as she managed their estate and ensured the family's economic survival. It was a partnership that defied the norms of the time, a testament to the shift in societal roles that the Reformation had unwittingly set in motion. Now, let's shift gears to Luther's writings on faith and works, which caused more than a few theological spit-takes across Europe. Luther was like the spiritual agitator-in-chief, proclaiming that faith alone, sola fide, was the ticket to salvation. This idea wasn't just revolutionary, it was downright scandalous. The establishment was used to a system where good works could curry favour with the divine, the sort of heavenly checklist. Luther flipped the script, arguing that salvation was a gift, not a transaction. This was as radical as suggesting that the earth revolved around the sun. Oh wait, that was happening too. Luther's doctrine of justification by faith alone was a theological earthquake, shaking the foundations of centuries-old church teachings. It wasn't just about questioning indulgences anymore. It was about redefining the very essence of Christian belief. For Luther, faith wasn't an accessory, it was the whole outfit. This notion didn't just alter religious landscape, it empowered individuals, encouraging them to read the Bible and interpret it for themselves. It was the democratization of spirituality, a concept as bold as it was controversial. But hold your applause. While Luther was busy rewriting religious doctrine, he also penned some less savoury opinions that modern admirers often gloss over. Let's address the elephant in the room, Luther's views on Jews. In his later years, he wrote virulent anti-Semitic tracts that are as disturbing as they are indefensible. He advocated for the destruction of synagogues and the expulsion of Jews from Christian lands, views that would later be weaponized in future centuries with catastrophic consequences. It's a dark stain on his legacy, a reminder that even the most revolutionary figures can harbor deeply flawed beliefs. Despite these darker chapters, Luther's impact on education and literacy was profound. He championed the idea that everyone should have access to the Bible, not just the elite few who could read Latin. This push for literacy led to the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages, making it accessible to the common folk for the first time. Imagine going from the Latin-only sacred texts to reading the Bible in your own dialect, a seismic shift that transformed how people connected with their faith. Luther's translation of the New Testament into German in 1522 was a pivotal moment. It wasn't just about words on a page, it was about empowering individuals to engage with Scripture directly. This was the intellectual equivalent of handing everyone the keys to the kingdom, with literacy rates starting to inch upwards as people clamoured for the ability to read this newly available text. Moreover, Luther's insistence on education for all, yes, including women, thank you very much, laid the groundwork for the modern educational systems we now take for granted. He believed that education was a public good, essential for creating informed citizens who could read, interpret, and engage with the world critically. In a sense, he was advocating for a society where knowledge was power, a radical notion that resonated far beyond theological circles. So, there you have it, Martin Luther, the man who shook the religious world to its core, found himself navigating the uncharted waters of domestic life with a partner who defied convention, while leaving behind a legacy both luminous and controversial. As his ideas on faith challenged the old guard, his personal life and later writings revealed a complex character, a man of profound contradictions. Luther's story isn't just one of reform, it's a saga of human complexity, rich with triumphs and failures, echoing through the corridors of history. And as Luther continued to wield his pen as a weapon of change, Europe was left grappling with the aftershocks of his theological earthquake. The stage was set for further upheaval, with the next act promising more twists and turns than a medieval morality play. Stay tuned, because the tale of Martin Luther and the Reformation is far from over. There's plenty more drama to come. As Luther's pen scribbled its final lines and his life drew to a close in 1546, he left behind a Europe that was as fragmented as a shattered stained glass window. His ideas had torn through the continent, creating a legacy of reform that was both a blessing and a curse. So, what did Luther really leave us with? A reformed church, a divided Europe, and an economic transformation that would shape the modern world. First, let's talk about the splintering of the Church. Before Luther, the Catholic Church was the unchallenged heavyweight, the spiritual monarch of Europe. But Luther's 95 Theses had opened Pandora's box, and once the lid was off, there was no shoving it all back in. Protestantism didn't come in a neat, single-serving package. It was more like a buffet of theological options. Calvinists, Anabaptists, Anglicans and more started popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. By 1550, Europe was a patchwork quilt of denominations, each region stitched with its own brand of reform and rebellion. This splintering wasn't just a religious issue, it was the spark for wars, treaties, and a century of unrest. Take the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, for instance. It was a geopolitical band-aid, allowing princes to choose the religion of their territory, a concept known as quaes regio, ius religio. The ruler's religion dictates the region's faith. It was a practical solution, but hardly a peaceful one. This compromise led to a Europe divided along confessional lines, setting the stage for conflicts like the 30 Years' War, which began in 1608 and left an estimated 8 million dead. Talk about a Pyrrhic victory. Now, let's dive into the economic side of things. Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church wasn't just a theological throwdown, it was an economic earthquake. The Protestant Reformation helped lay the groundwork for capitalism, often credited with fueling the rise of the Protestant work ethic. This was the idea that hard work and thrift were signs of divine favor, a radical departure from the medieval mindset that equated piety with poverty. Max Weber, a German sociologist, later argued that this ethic was a driving force behind the development of Western capitalism. It was like giving capitalism a holy seal of approval, encouraging entrepreneurs to hustle like their eternal salvation depended on it. In Protestant regions, the Church's land and wealth were redistributed, often ending up in the hands of secular princes and the burgeoning middle class. This transfer of wealth helped weaken feudal structures and promote the growth of a market economy. By 1600, cities like Geneva and Amsterdam were economic powerhouses, thriving under Protestant influence. The Catholic Church's loss of financial and political power was a gain for the emerging nation-states, each vying for dominance in a rapidly changing world. But hold your horses, it's not all sunshine and free markets. The Reformation also led to cultural and social upheaval, with iconoclasm sweeping through Europe like a wrecking ball. Churches were stripped of their ornate decorations, religious images smashed, stained glass shattered. Art and beauty sacrificed on the altar of reform. This was the puritanical side of Protestantism, where simplicity was the new sacred, and anything that smacked of idolatry was tossed out faster than yesterday's leftovers. And then there's Luther himself, a man whose legacy is as contradictory as they come. On one hand, he's the father of Protestantism, a man who dared to challenge the might of the papacy and stood firm against corruption. On the other, he's the author of some deeply troubling anti-Semitic writings, a stain on his legacy that history cannot ignore. His story is a tapestry of myth and reality, a mix of heroism and human frailty. So, what can we learn from Luther's legacy today? Perhaps it's the idea that change doesn't come neatly packaged. It often arrives with mess, conflict, and unintended consequences. Luther's Reformation was a catalyst for progress, but it also unleashed a torrent of division and strife that reshaped Europe for centuries. It's a reminder that the path to reform is rarely straight or smooth, often fraught with compromise and contradiction. As we look back at Luther's life and legacy, it's clear that history is a complex blend of myth and reality. The stories we tell about figures like Luther are never just about the past. They're reflections of our present, revealing our hopes, fears, and the eternal struggle for truth and justice. And while the storm of the Reformation may have settled, its echoes continue to reverberate, reminding us that the quest for reform is as relevant now as it was over 5 centuries ago. So, the next time you ponder the power of one person's ideas to ignite change, remember Luther, the monk who dared to question the status quo and, in doing so, set the world on a new course. In the world of 18th century royalty, it's safe to say that Frederick the Great's early life was less Prince Charming and more teenage soap opera. Picture a young Frederick, not yet the Great, but rather the Pained, living in a Baroque-era sitcom where his father, King Frederick William I, played the role of a strict, military-obsessed tyrant. The king had a penchant for collecting soldiers like some people collect stamps. His elite, Potsdam Giants Regiment, comprised of men taller than 6'2", was more about eye candy than battlefield brawn, costing the Prussian state a fortune. But that's a story for another day. Let's rewind to the early 1700s. Frederick, born in 1712, was supposed to be the obedient heir to the Prussian throne, but he had other ideas. The young prince was more interested in French literature and flute sonatas than the art of war. Imagine his father's dismay when Frederick preferred Voltaire to von Clausewitz. Their relationship was the kind of father-son dynamic that makes daytime TV drama look tame. Frederick William I was all about discipline and duty, while Frederick was sneaking peeks at poetry and playing music under the covers. The tension came to a head in 1730, when young Freddie decided he'd had enough of his father's iron grip and planned what could only be described as the most ill-conceived escape attempt in royal history. He and his best friend, Hans Hermann von Katter, who, by the way, was the kind of friend your parents warn you about, concocted a plan to flee the oppressive Prussian court and make a new life in England. Why England? Perhaps Frederick had a romantic notion of sipping tea and discussing philosophy with the English elite. Or maybe he just fancied a change from his father's endless military drills and barracks talk. Their plan was about as airtight as a leaky teapot. Frederick and Catty's attempt to flee was foiled almost before it started. Soldiers, ever the loyal subjects to King Frederick William, caught wind of their scheming and nipped the escape in the bud. The fallout was swift and brutal. Frederick was arrested, and his father, in a display of patented Prussian severity, sentenced Catty to death. Talk about harsh parenting. On November 6, 1730, Frederick was forced to watch his friend's beheading from his prison cell. It was a traumatizing spectacle that would haunt him for the rest of his life, a grim reminder of his father's ruthlessness and the cost of rebellion. In the wake of this failed escape and the tragedy of Catty's execution, Frederick found himself a prisoner both literally and metaphorically. His father had him tossed in jail, as if grounding a teenager with a passion for French poetry required incarceration. The king was determined to snuff out any whiff of rebellion and set his son on a correct path, one paved with military rigour and strategic acumen. It's almost as if Frederick William I took a page out of the How to Parent Like a Despot handbook. And so began Frederick's forced education in the military arts. He was grudgingly dragged through a boot camp for monarchs, where he was drilled in the strategic doctrines of the day. Ironically, this unwanted education became the bedrock of Frederick's future brilliance. It's one of history's great twists. The king's attempt to break his son's spirit only sharpened Frederick's strategic mind. He absorbed military tactics and strategies like a sponge, and in time transformed himself into the commander his father had always wanted, but on his own terms. Frederick's turbulent youth, filled with rebellion, punishment, and an intense education, was the crucible that forged his legendary status. This was the origin story of a king who would go on to redefine what it meant to be a ruler in Europe. But as much as he became known for his military genius, it's crucial to remember that it all started with a flute-playing, poetry-loving young prince who once dreamed of escaping to a land where he could be free from his father's shadow. In the end, Frederick the Great emerged not despite his tumultuous youth, but because of it. History, it seems, has a way of making the unlikeliest of events into stepping stones for greatness. As Frederick the Great ascended to the throne in 1740, the Kingdom of Prussia was about to see a shift that would make even the most seasoned political observers sit up and take notice. The young king, fresh from the crucible of his father's relentless tutelage, was now ready to command not just a kingdom but attention. And he didn't waste any time. His first major move was as bold as it was controversial, an invasion of Silesia. Now, if you've got a map handy, you'll find Silesia nestled between modern-day Poland and the Czech Republic. Back then, it was like the crown jewel of Central Europe, known for its rich natural resources and strategic position. Why Silesia, you ask? Well, Frederick had his eyes on the economic prize. Silesia was a veritable treasure trove with its sprawling coal mines, fertile land, and a booming textile industry. If Prussia could control this region, it would not only boost the economy, but also expand its influence, like upgrading from a tricycle to a Harley-Davidson. Plus, the region was under the rule of Austria, and Frederick saw an opportunity in the chaos following the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. The throne had passed to his daughter, Maria Theresa, and Frederick figured she might be too busy juggling the Habsburg Empire's problems to put up much of a fight. Frederick's decision to invade was as unexpected as pineapple on a pizza. Some people love it, others are horrified. But here's where Frederick's strategic genius really started to shine. He didn't just march in with a traditional frontal assault. Oh no, he employed a cunning tactic known as the oblique order. Imagine a battlefield where one side suddenly shifts its weight to attack the enemy at an angle instead of head-on. This was Frederick's secret sauce, a tactic that allowed his forces to concentrate their strength on a single point of the enemy's line, disrupting their formation and causing chaos. It was all about bringing the element of surprise, like showing up to a formal dinner in a Hawaiian shirt. By May 1745, Frederick's tactics paid off big time at the Battle of Hohenfriedberg. This battle became a showcase of his military acumen and cemented his reputation as a force to be reckoned with. The Prussian army, outnumbered but not outwitted, managed to rout the Austrian forces in a decisive victory. The numbers were staggering. The Prussians had around 60,000 troops, while the Austrians fielded over 80,000. Despite being outgunned, Frederick's forces inflicted significant casualties, with nearly 9,000 Austrians either killed, wounded, or captured, compared to around 4,800 Prussian casualties. It was a tactical masterclass, like winning a chess game by sacrificing your queen just to checkmate your opponent 2 moves later. The victory at Hohenfriedberg sent shockwaves across Europe. Suddenly, Frederick wasn't just the upstart king of a middling German state, he was a major player on the European stage. The economic ripples were equally profound. With Silesia firmly under Prussian control, the region's wealth flowed into Frederick's coffers, funding further military campaigns and solidifying Prussia's status as an economic powerhouse. In the grand game of European politics, Frederick had turned over a new card, and it was a trump. But let's not romanticize this too much. War, even when waged with tactical brilliance, is a brutal business. The political landscape of Europe was a delicate balance, and Frederick's aggressive expansionism upset the apple cart. Austria, of course, was not pleased. Maria Theresa, far from being a pushover, was rallying her forces for a counterattack. The conflict over Silesia would continue to simmer, contributing to the larger war of the Austrian succession that embroiled much of Europe. Frederick's rise to prominence was as much about savvy statecraft as it was military might. Behind the scenes, he was also strengthening Prussia's economy, reforming its bureaucracy, and ensuring that the state could sustain the demands of war. These were not the actions of a mere warrior king. They were the maneuvers of a strategic genius who understood that power was as much about economic stability as it was about battlefield victories. Yet, as impressive as Frederick's early victories were, they were only the beginning of a larger story. The young king had set the stage for a series of events that would not only define his reign but also reshape the map of Europe. The impact of his actions would be felt far beyond the borders of Prussia, rippling through the political, economic, and social fabric of the continent. As we leave Frederick at this juncture, standing triumphantly amid the smoke and chaos of Hohenfriedberg, it's important to remember that this was just one chapter in a much larger saga. Frederick's legacy, much like his tactics, was complex and multifaceted, a blend of ambition, brilliance, and the harsh realities of an era where power was often won at the end of a bayonet. As we dive deeper into his story, we'll explore how this king continued to navigate the perilous waters of 18th century politics, always one step ahead, always with an eye on the next opportunity, not unlike a chess master plotting his next gambit. Just when you thought Frederick's story couldn't get any more intense, enter the 7 Years' War. Stage left, a conflict so sprawling it makes Game of Thrones look like a neighborhood squabble. We're talking about a war that stretched across continents, from the forests of North America to the heat of India. This was the 18th century equivalent of a global blockbuster, and Frederick was right there in the thick of it, holding a script that read more like a do-or-die manifesto than a royal decree. Now, let's set the scene. It's 1756, and Europe is a simmering stew of geopolitical grudges. Frederick, ever the opportunist, finds himself squaring off against a veritable who's who of European powers. Austria, France, Russia, Sweden and Saxony all lined up against little old Prussia. It's like the ultimate David and Goliath matchup, except David's armed with bayonets and a strategic playbook that would make Sun Tzu nod in approval. You see, Frederick wasn't just playing defense. Oh no, he was all about the preemptive strike. He kicked off the war by invading Saxony, a move as bold as it was controversial. Why Saxony, you ask? Well, it was the logistical linchpin of Central Europe. Control Saxony. And you've got a nice launching pad for operations against Austria and a buffer zone against the encroaching French. Plus, Saxony had this nifty little thing called the Saxon Treasury, which Frederick promptly appropriated to fund his military exploits. It was like a hostile corporate takeover, Prussian style. Frederick's strategy was a blend of audacity and precision. He employed what military historians call interior lines, a fancy term for using central positioning to move troops quickly and efficiently between fronts. Imagine a maestro conducting an orchestra, each section moving in harmony with the others. This was Frederick at his finest, outmaneuvering his enemies with a combination of speed, surprise, and sheer chutzpah. But let's not sugarcoat it. The logistics of 18th century warfare were a nightmare of epic proportions. We're talking about moving tens of thousands of troops across muddy, rutted roads, through dense forests and over swollen rivers. Supplies were another beast entirely. An army, as they say, marches on its stomach, and Frederick's forces required mountains of bread, meat, and beer. Yes, beer. In a time before energy drinks, beer was the hydration of choice for the Prussian soldier. The costs were staggering. By the end of the war, Prussia was shelling out around 25 million thalers annually, an astronomical sum that put the kingdom's finances on the brink. It was like running a marathon with a lead weight tied to each leg, and no amount of fiscal wizardry could change the fact that Prussia was punching well above its economic weight class. And then there was the human toll. Battles like Rossbach and Leuthen became legendary for Frederick's tactical brilliance, but they were also bloodbaths that left thousands dead or maimed. At Rossbach in 1757, Frederick's 22,000 men faced off against a Franco-imperial army more than twice their size. By the end of the day, the Prussians had inflicted over 10,000 casualties while suffering fewer than 600 themselves. It was a staggering victory, but it came with the grim reminder of war's relentless cost. This brings us to the so-called miracle of the House of Brandenburg. By 1762, Frederick's situation looked dire. His enemies were closing in, and Prussia was financially and militarily exhausted. Then, in a twist worthy of a Hollywood script, Empress Elizabeth of Russia died, and her successor, Peter III, a fanboy of Frederick's, promptly switched sides. It was the kind of stroke of luck that generals dream of and historians debate endlessly. This miracle wasn't just about a change in alliances, it was a testament to Frederick's enduring reputation. Love him or hate him, he had become a symbol of resilience, an iron-willed monarch who, against all odds, held his own against Europe's great powers. His legend was cemented not just by his victories, but by his ability to endure, adapt, and, when necessary, capitalize on sheer dumb luck. But let's keep it real. Frederick's genius was as much about survival as it was about strategy. The 7 Years' War was a meat grinder, leaving Europe battered and bruised, with a new balance of power that would influence future conflicts. Frederick emerged from the chaos with his kingdom intact, but at a staggering cost in blood and treasure. Prussia was now a major player on the European stage, yet the price of admission had been steep, paid in the currency of human suffering and national debt. As we wrap up this chapter, it's crucial to recognize that Frederick's story is far from over. His legacy, like the man himself, is a complex tapestry woven from threads of brilliance, ambition, and the harsh realities of 18th century geopolitics. The 7 Years' War was a crucible that tested the mettle of nations and men, and Frederick, with his mix of audacity and endurance, proved he could play in the big leagues. But with great power comes great responsibility and challenges waiting just around the corner. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into Frederick's continuing saga, where the stakes remain high and the drama is anything but over. So, where were we? Ah, yes, Frederick the Great, fresh from the grueling marathon of the 7 Years' War, standing astride the European landscape like a chess master who just pulled off a high-stakes gambit. But let's not get carried away with the hero worship just yet. It's time to peel back the layers of this iconic monarch and see what really made him tick. Was he the Enlightenment's answer to a philosopher king, or just a pragmatic ruler with a flair for the dramatic? First, let's talk about Frederick's supposed Enlightenment ideals. Oh, he loved to rub shoulders with the intellectual glitterati of his time. His correspondence with Voltaire alone could fill a library. And let's not forget his patronage of the arts. Under Frederick, Berlin became a cultural hotspot, a place where music and philosophy were as much a part of the court scene as powdered wigs and awkward dances. He even built the elegant Sanssouci Palace, a Rococo masterpiece that screams uncultured louder than a Parisian café on Bastille Day. But here's the twist. While Frederick was busy playing the part of the cultured king, he was also ruling Prussia with an iron fist. His governance was as much about pragmatic control as it was about high-minded ideals. Sure, he talked a big game about meritocracy, but the reality was he ran Prussia like a well-oiled machine, or maybe more like a military barracks. Civil servants were expected to be as disciplined as his soldiers. Slackers need not apply. Economically, the guy was no slouch either. He modernized the Prussian bureaucracy and introduced reforms that would make even the most dedicated bean counter's heart flutter. Frederick had a knack for efficiency, turning the proverbial bureaucratic ship like a speedboat. He encouraged agricultural improvements, drained marshlands, and introduced new crops like potatoes. That's right, the humble spud was once a foreign curiosity, and Frederick marketed it as if it were the 18th century equivalent of the iPhone. Yet for all his talk of Enlightenment values, freedom of speech wasn't exactly flourishing under Frederick's rule. He had a habit of censoring the press and keeping a tight grip on what could be published. His reign witnessed the paradox of a king who championed ideas and yet feared the free flow of them. Frederick's Prussia was a bit like an open-air museum, beautiful to behold, but with ropes keeping you from touching anything. So, was he the philosopher king, or the ultimate PR spin master? Maybe a bit of both. Frederick knew the value of image. In a time when monarchs were as much brand managers as rulers, he crafted a persona that combined military prowess with intellectual sophistication. He projected an image of himself as a ruler who was as comfortable discussing metaphysics as he was strategizing on the battlefield. But talk to his subjects, and you might hear a different tune, one of endless military drills, taxes, and the pressure to conform to Frederick's vision of a modern state. Let's not forget his relationship with religion either. Frederick had a famously skeptical approach to organized faith, often quipping that all religions were equally ridiculous. Yet he understood the power of the church as a political tool and maintained Protestantism as the state religion. He was a master of playing both sides, keeping the clergy in check while promoting religious tolerance, so long as it didn't interfere with his plans. By now, you might be wondering if Frederick ever caught a break from all this ruling and philosophizing. Well, kind of. He was a man of contradictions, after all. His personal life was a kaleidoscope of conflicting tales. Some say he was a lonely figure, others paint him as a man who found solace in art and music. His relationship with Voltaire was both a meeting of minds and a comedy of errors, with their friendship dissolving over disputes about, what else? Money and ego. Through all this, Frederick remained a figure larger than life. His legacy is one of complexity, a blend of light and shadow. As we dive deeper into his story, remember that the myth and the reality often walked hand in hand. Frederick the Great was a man who could inspire with one hand and rule with an iron grip with the other, a true product of his age, and yet a timeless figure whose story continues to intrigue. So where does that leave us on our journey through Frederick's world? We've seen him navigate the political minefields of Europe, wield military genius like a conductor with a baton, and craft an image that made him a legend in his own time. But there's more to uncover. The Enlightenment ideals he championed and the authoritarian methods he employed were two sides of the same coin, each revealing a different part of his complex character. As we move forward, keep in mind that the allure of Frederick's story lies not just in what he achieved, but in how he balanced, or perhaps juggled, the competing demands of power, progress, and personal ambition. Stay tuned, because the saga of Frederick the Great is far from over. As we glide into the twilight of Frederick the Great's life, one might expect the old king to kick back in a rocking chair, reflect on his conquests, and maybe compose a sonata or two. But this is Frederick we're talking about, a monarch who probably considered relaxation just another word for wasting time. Even in his later years, Frederick was busy cementing a legacy that would echo through history like the reverberating notes of one of his beloved flute concertos. Let's start with his military reforms. Frederick's army wasn't just a group of men in uniform. It was his pride and joy, a meticulously crafted machine that ran on precision and discipline. Under his reign, the Prussian military became the envy of Europe, a model of efficiency and effectiveness that other nations could only dream of replicating. We're talking about an era when Frederick's troops could march 15 miles a day, a feat that would put even the most dedicated marathoners to shame. It wasn't just about speed, though. His soldiers were trained to maneuver like chess pieces on a board, executing complex formations with the kind of precision that made Swiss watches look sloppy. Frederick's military prowess wasn't just for show. It had real, tangible effects on Prussia's economic landscape. With a secure and formidable army, Frederick could turn his attention to building a robust economy. He knew that a strong kingdom needed more than just soldiers. It needed a foundation of prosperity. So, he introduced economic policies that would make a modern economist nod in approval. He encouraged the growth of industries, from textiles to mining, and promoted trade by improving infrastructure. Roads and canals became the veins through which the lifeblood of commerce flowed, linking the kingdom in ways that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. Now, let's talk culture, because Frederick wasn't just a soldier king. He was also a patron of the arts who fancied himself a bit of a Renaissance man. Under his rule, Prussia experienced a cultural renaissance that transformed Berlin from a provincial backwater into a vibrant hub of creativity. Musicians flocked to his court, and the arts flourished under his patronage. It was a time when the air was filled with the sounds of symphonies and philosophers debated the latest ideas over cups of steaming coffee. Frederick's cultural investments were like a breath of fresh air in a world where the arts often took a back seat to the brutal realities of warfare. But hold on, before you start picturing Frederick as the benevolent maestro of a cultural utopia, let's debunk a few myths. While he was busy fostering the arts, he was also ruling with an iron fist. Frederick's policies might have been enlightened in theory, but in practice they often left little room for dissent. His kingdom was a well-oiled machine, but it was one he kept tightly controlled. Think of it as a grand symphony where every musician must play exactly as the conductor commands, or risk being shown the door. And then there's the myth of Frederick as the benevolent ruler. Sure, he had a knack for progressive policies, but let's not pretend he was all sunshine and rainbows. His reforms were often driven by a pragmatic desire to strengthen his state, not an altruistic love for his subjects. For instance, his religious tolerance wasn't born out of a deep-seated belief in equality. It was a shrewd political move to maintain stability and prevent unrest. After all, a kingdom divided by religious strife is a kingdom vulnerable to external threats, and Frederick couldn't have that. In his final years, Frederick transformed from a warrior king into a wise old statesman, dispensing advice like a sage atop a mountain. He spent his days at Sanssouci, his beloved palace, surrounded by the art and music he held dear, yet he remained ever vigilant, his mind sharp and his interest in statecraft undiminished. Even as his body aged, his spirit remained as vibrant as ever, a testament to his relentless drive and indomitable will. So, what can modern leaders learn from Frederick's life? For starters, there's the lesson that leadership is a delicate balance between strength and flexibility. Frederick understood that power wasn't just about wielding a sword. It was about creating a legacy that could withstand the tests of time. He knew that true leadership required the ability to adapt, to embrace change, and to foster innovation. His story is a reminder that even the most powerful leaders must keep an eye on the future and never rest on their laurels. Frederick's life also teaches us about the dual nature of progress. His reign was marked by both cultural enlightenment and authoritarian control, a paradox that modern leaders would do well to remember. Progress is often accompanied by challenges and contradictions, and true leadership lies in navigating these complexities with wisdom and foresight. As we wrap up our journey through the life and legacy of Frederick the Great, we're left with a portrait of a man who was as complex as the times in which he lived. He was a ruler who defied easy categorization, a military genius, a cultural patron, a pragmatic reformer, and a shrewd politician. His legacy is a tapestry of triumphs and contradictions, woven together by the threads of ambition and determination. In the end, Frederick's story is a testament to the enduring power of vision and the relentless pursuit of greatness. His life reminds us that the path to legacy is rarely straightforward, and that the most compelling stories are those that challenge our perceptions and inspire us to see the world in new ways. So as you drift off to sleep, let the echoes of Frederick's flute sonatas guide you into dreams of history's grand tapestry, where leaders like Frederick the Great continue to inspire and challenge us to this day.